Hello everyone, I am the narrator and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The silence here isn't empty, it's hungry. I realize this too late. My name is Daniel Reed, and for 15 years I've appraised rural properties for Westland real estate. I've seen abandoned homesteads, dilapidated mansions, and forgotten farmhouses across 3 states. Nothing prepared me for the Blackwell farm. The property sat untouched for 27 years in northern Vermont, surrounded by dense woodland on 3 sides and a stretch of barren field on the fourth. It was a large 2-story farmhouse with a stone foundation and weathered clapboard siding, paint peeled away by decades of neglect. When I first arrived, I noted how unnaturally quiet the place was. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, not even the rustle of the breeze through the tall grass that surrounded the house. My footsteps crunched across the gravel driveway, the sound sharp against the overwhelming silence. The air felt thick, resistant, as if the property itself pushed back against my presence. I checked my phone, no service as expected, and pulled out my digital recorder standard procedure document. Observations verbally while taking photographs, I clicked the recorder on and spoke my usual introduction, property assessment, Blackwell Farm. October 17th, Daniel Reed conducting evaluation for potential auction listing. My voice sounded flat, the words failing to carry the short distance I expected. It was as if the air absorbed the sound waves, prematurely dulling them. An acoustic anomaly caused by the surrounding trees, I rationalized and continued toward the main entrance. The realtor who contracted me had provided minimal details. The farm had been abandoned after the owner, Harold Blackwell, disappeared in the late 90s. No relatives had claimed the property, and after decades of tax delinquency, the county had seized it. My job was straightforward: assess condition, estimate renovation costs, determine market value. The front door opened with surprising ease. No squeal from the hinges as one might expect from long disuse. I stepped inside and immediately the temperature dropped several degrees. The entryway opened to a living room on the right and a dining room to the left with a central staircase leading to the second floor. Dust motes floated in shafts of light from the windows, but less dust covered the surfaces than I would have expected from nearly 3 decades of abandonment. I clicked on my flashlight and began the assessment, moving methodically through the ground floor. The house was structurally sound, remarkably so for its age and neglect. Most of the furniture remained covered with white sheets that had yellowed with time. I pulled back one of the sheets to reveal a vintage sofa, its fabric faded but intact. That's when I heard it, a whisper so faint I thought I'd imagined it. A woman's voice saying something about dinner preparations. I froze, straining to hear more, but the sound didn't repeat. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but my voice seemed to fall flat, absorbed by the walls. Almost as soon as it left my mouth, I continued through the dining room, noting the solid oak table, the china cabinet still full of dishes. My flashlight beam caught something unusual about the walls. They were constructed of a stone material I hadn't encountered before, a pale limestone with unusual striations covered with wallpaper in most places, but exposed in others where the paper had peeled away. Curiosity led me to touch one of these exposed sections. Running my fingers along the cool surface, the effect was immediate and startling. Best harvest we've had in 7 years, Thompson says we should expect a man's voice. Clear as if someone stood beside me, though with a strange echoing quality. I jerked my hand away, heart suddenly pounding. The voice cut off immediately. I stood motionless, wondering if I'd finally cracked after years of working alone in abandoned properties. The alternate explanation that I'd actually heard a disembodied voice from the past seemed even less plausible. I forced myself to touch the wall again, this time pressing my palm flat against the strange stone. Going to need more storage space if this trend continues, maybe convert the north shed. The same voice continuing a conversation about farm operations as if I'd unpaused a recording. I moved my hand to another section of exposed wall and the voice changed. Told her the preserves won't last through winter at this rate. She doesn't listen, never listens. A different conversation, possibly years apart from the first. It was like the stone itself had absorbed these conversations, preserved them somehow within its crystalline structure. My scientific mind raced for an explanation while a more primitive part recoiled at the impossibility. I spoke aloud, my voice sounding weaker than it should. This is incredible. I checked my recorder only to find it displayed an error message. No recording had been saved. I tried again, speaking directly into it, but the device refused to capture my voice. The batteries were new, the memory empty. There was no reason for the malfunction. My curiosity temporarily overwhelming my unease, I moved through the house, touching different sections of exposed wall. Each revealed different fragments of the past, domestic conversations, arguments, celebrations. Some dated back many decades, judging by the antiquated speech patterns and references to events long past. In the kitchen, touching the stone above the sink, I heard children laughing, playing some game involving counting. Their voices were bright innocent. This seemed to be a happy home. Once, despite whatever had led to its abandonment, I pulled out my phone to take photographs of the unusual stone, but found the battery suddenly drained from a full charge to nothing. Electronic failures near certain geological formations weren't unheard of, but this seemed extreme. I'd have to rely on my written notes and memory. It was when I ventured upstairs that the experience shifted from fascinating to disturbing. The upper floor contained 4 bedrooms and a bathroom, all with the same strange stone construction beneath peeling wallpaper and paint. But the voices I heard here had a different quality: strained, anxious, afraid. In the master bedroom, I touched the wall and heard, "Not natural, Helen." You felt it too, the way the silence swallows everything. I wake up more tired than when I went to bed, like something's draining. The voice cut off when I removed my hand, but the fear in it was unmistakable. In another bedroom, a different fragment keeps getting worse. I can barely hear myself think anymore. Dr. Jensen says it's stress, but it's this house. It's doing something to us. My professional detachment was crumbling. My throat had grown increasingly dry, and when I tried to clear it, the sound seemed feeble, contained within my own skull. Rather than projecting outward, a peculiar fatigue had settled into my limbs. Despite having been in the house less than an hour, I decided to check the basement before leaving. The door was located off the kitchen, and unlike the rest of the house, it resisted opening as if sealed by vacuum pressure. When it finally gave way, stale air rushed past me, carrying with it the mineral scent of deep earth. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into near complete darkness. My flashlight beam seemed dimmer, struggling to penetrate the unusual density of the darkness. The basement walls were entirely composed of the strange stone. No wallpaper or paint covering them here. The floor was packed earth, and at the center stood a large natural column of the same stone material, reaching from floor to ceiling like a support pillar. I approached cautiously, aware that my breathing had become labored, each inhale requiring conscious effort. When I touched the central column, the voice I heard sent ice through my veins, discovered something remarkable in the cave system beneath the north field. The acoustics are unlike anything I've encountered. Sound waves don't just reverberate, they're somehow captured, preserved within the stone itself. I've extracted enough to begin construction. If my theory proves correct, this house will become a living record, a repository of our lives. Harold Blackwell's voice, I presume the original owner. His tone was excited, academic, like a researcher on the verge of breakthrough. I moved my hand to another section of the column. Growing weaker by the day, Helen says she can barely speak above a whisper now. The children are lethargic. I've made a terrible mistake. The stone doesn't just record sound, it consumes it, consumes the energy carried by sound waves. Perhaps more, we need to leave. But I fear my heart hammered against my ribs as the implications sank in. The strange fatigue, my weakening voice, the dead electronics. The house was feeding on energy, sound being merely the most evident manifestation I needed to leave immediately. I turned toward the stairs and my flashlight flickered out completely. In the sudden darkness, I became aware of another sound, a low rhythmic pulsing that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Not a mechanical sound, but something organic, like the beating of an enormous heart. The stone was alive, or at least functioning as a unified organism. Panic propelled me toward where I remembered the stairs to be. My foot caught on something, a roux or cable, and I stumbled forward, hands outstretched. They connected with more of the stone, and this time the voices were a cacophony, dozens speaking simultaneously, their words garbled but their emotions clear. Fear, desperation, realization too late of the trap they'd wandered into. I pulled myself up the stairs, each step requiring more effort than it should. My muscles felt lean, unresponsive. The door at the top seemed miles away. When I finally reached it, my hands were trembling so violently I could barely grip the handle. The kitchen was dimmer than I remembered the shafts of sunlight from the windows, now seeming to terminate abruptly a few feet into the room as if the light itself was being consumed. My breathing echoed strangely in my ears, too loud internally, but I sensed it made barely any sound in the actual air. I staggered through the house toward the front door, one hand trailing along the wall for support. With each contact, more voices spilled into my consciousness. Can't leave. Tried 3 times. Always find myself back inside. Somehow, car won't start. Phone dead, no way to call for getting weaker, can barely stand now. It's taking something from us, I realized with growing horror that I wasn't hearing just the Blackwell family. Others had come here, perhaps other assessors, potential buyers, curious locals, and somehow their experiences had been absorbed into the house as well. How many people had this place claimed over the decades, and why hadn't I heard about any of these disappearances? The front door stood before me, sunlight visible through its window tantalizingly close. My hand closed around the door knob, and for one terrible moment it refused to turn as if fused shut. Then it relented, and I practically fell onto the porch outside. The fresh air should have been a relief, but I found I couldn't draw a proper breath. My lungs expanded, but it felt like inhaling cotton. I stumbled to my car, fumbling with the keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. The engine turned over on the 3rd attempt. I reversed down the driveway so quickly I nearly hit a tree, then sped down the rural road away from the property. Only after several miles did my breathing begin to ease, the crushing pressure on my chest gradually lifting. At a gas station 20 meters away, I tried to speak to the attendant, but no sound emerged. Panic seized me again until after several attempts, a raspy whisper materialized. My voice returned slowly over the next few hours, though it remained weaker than before, with a persistent hoarseness that 3 doctors and a specialist have been unable to explain. I submitted my report on the Blackwell farm with a single recommendation: demolition. I fabricated structural issues, extensive water damage, and hazardous materials to justify the conclusion. My supervisor questioned the assessment, noting it contradicted preliminary reports, but eventually conceded to my expertise. That should have been the end of it. But 3 nights ago, I woke to a familiar sensation. That oppressive silence, the feeling of sound being swallowed in the darkness of my bedroom. I swear I heard the faintest whisper in my own voice, speaking words I'd uttered inside that house. Somehow a piece of it had followed me home. I've checked every wall of my house looking for signs of that strange stone. I found nothing, yet the sensation persists. The ENT specialist says my vocal cords show unusual atrophy for a man my age. When I speak now, people lean in to hear me. Sometimes when I'm alone, I press my ear against the walls of my home and listen. So far, they remain silent. But each morning, my voice grows slightly weaker, and I wonder how long before it disappears, completely preserved somewhere in that hungry house. Another whisper trapped within the walls. Story 2. The corridor outside my apartment felt wrong tonight. I couldn't immediately identify why, but something in the air seemed to resist my presence. A heaviness that pressed against my skin and made the familiar hallway feel like foreign territory. The flickering overhead light cast sickly yellow patterns across the worn carpet. transforming the mundane into something sinister. As I approached my door, exhaustion from my 12-hour night shift weighing on my shoulders, I noticed it was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness inviting me into what should have been the safety of my home. I stood frozen keys dangling from my trembling fingers. I lived alone. I always locked my door. Always. A rational explanation tried to form in my mind. Perhaps I'd been too tired this morning and had forgotten to secure the lock, but the prickling sensation at the back of my neck suggested otherwise. Something was waiting for me inside. Pushing the door open with my fingertips, I peered into the darkness of my apartment. The streetlights outside cast feeble illumination through the blinds, creating strange elongated shadows across my living room. I fumbled for the light switch, my heart already picking up. Pace, the sound of my own pulse thundering in my ears. The overhead light revealed my living room in its familiar arrangement. Almost. My eyes caught on small discrepancies that sent ice through my veins. The cushions on my couch had been rearranged. Not drastically, but enough that I noticed the coffee table book about architectural history that I always kept perfectly centered was now askew, pushed to one corner. My collection of vinyl records, normally alphabetized meticulously, had been subtly rearranged. Bowie now where the Beatles should be. I took a hesitant step inside, scanning for signs of a break-in. Nothing valuable seemed missing. My laptop remained on the desk. My wallet sat untouched on the side table where I'd left it. This wasn't a robbery. Someone or something had simply moved through my space, touching my belongings, shifting reality just enough to make me question my own perception. I called out, hoping for the mundane explanation of a maintenance worker or even a neighbor who might have entered by mistake. My voice emerged as a hoarse whisper, swallowed immediately by the unnatural stillness of the apartment. No response came. A soft noise from the kitchen caught my attention, the subtle sound of metal against metal, a utensil perhaps sliding across the counter. My muscles tensed, adrenaline flooding my system. I reached for my phone, meaning to call for help, only to find it unresponsive. The battery drained, though I charged it fully before my shift. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. A window left open, allowing a draft to move things, the building's settling pipes contracting in the old plumbing system. But these thoughts provided little comfort as I moved toward the kitchen, my footsteps painfully loud on the hardwood floor. The kitchen doorway revealed a scene that defied explanation. In the dim light filtering from the living room, I could see my cutlery drawer open its contents, gleaming as I watched a knife slid from one side of the drawer to the other as if pushed by invisible fingers. The refrigerator hummed its tone, unnaturally deep, more vibration than sound. On the counter, my coffee mug rotated slowly, the dark liquid inside it rippling without any apparent cause. My breath caught in my throat. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, so drastically that I could see my exhalations forming clouds in the air. Goosebumps erupted across my skin, and a violent shiver racked my body. The cold felt ancient, as if it emanated not from any modern source, but from some primordial well of ice that had existed since before human memory. I blinked rapidly, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to convince myself that exhaustion was causing me to hallucinate. The mug stopped its rotation. The knife settled in the drawer. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I had imagined it all. Then I saw the handprint. It appeared on the white wall beside the refrigerator, a vivid red impression of a human hand. The fingers elongated and unnaturally thin. The substance glistened wetly in the dim light. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat as I watched in horror another print materialized beside it, as if pressed there by an invisible presence. Then another and another. A trail of bloody handprints began forming across my kitchen wall, moving in my direction. My legs almost gave out beneath me. My heart hammered so violently I feared it might burst from my chest. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the bone-deep cold. I wanted to run, to flee from my apartment and never return, but my body refused to obey, locked in place by primal terror. The handprint stopped appearing just short of where I stood. In the silence that followed, I became aware of a presence, Not something I could see or hear, but something I could feel with absolute certainty. A consciousness that filled the room like smoke, ancient and patient and utterly alien. It observed me with an intensity that felt physical, like pressure against my skin. The building I lived in was old, constructed in the 1920s. I recalled the rumors I dismissed when I signed the lease. Stories told by neighbors about strange occurrences about the basement that remained permanently locked about the original owner who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances nearly a century ago. The landlord had laughed these tales off as urban legends designed to give the building character to justify the surprisingly affordable rent in this otherwise expensive neighborhood. Now, as an unnatural silence enveloped my kitchen and bloody handprints dried on my wall, those dismissed rumors crystallized into a terrible possibility. A memory surfaced. The elderly woman from apartment 3B who had cornered me in the laundry room my first week. She had asked how I was sleeping, if I'd heard the voices yet. I had smiled politely and escaped her rambling conversation about the building, remembering what happened here. At the time, I had written her off as confused, possibly suffering from dementia. Now her words echoed in my mind with new significance. Something in my apartment wanted me to know it was here. It wanted me to see evidence of its presence. But why now, after I'd lived here for nearly 8 months without incident? The cutting board on the counter suddenly slid toward me, stopping at the edge. My breath hitched, I took a step backward, and the board moved again, maintaining the same distance between us, not threatening, beckoning. Against every instinct screaming for me to run, I approached. The board was old, scarred with countless knife marks from previous tenants. I'd always meant to replace it, but never got around to it. Now, as I look closer, I realize some of the deeper grooves formed patterns, letters perhaps. I tilted my head, trying to decipher the markings in the dim light. A name took shape before my eyes, the letters becoming more distinct as I focused on them. Elas. The name meant nothing to me. I had never heard it mentioned in connection with the building. Yet as soon as I recognized it, the atmosphere in the kitchen changed. The pressure intensified. The cold deepened until it penetrated to my bones. The bloody handprints on the wall began to drip, the red substance running downward in rivulets that defied gravity, flowing horizontally across the wall to form more letters. Beneath, my phone suddenly flickered to life in my pocket, the screen glowing with unnatural brightness. I pulled it out, finding not my home screen, but a black and white photograph I had never seen before. An old image of my building dated 1924. In the foreground stood a group of men in period clothing, their faces solemn. One figure was circled in red, his features blurred as if he had moved during the exposure. Text had been typed across the bottom of the image. He knows you found it. Found what I had discovered. Nothing disturbed nothing. I had simply existed in this space, going about my life unaware of whatever history lay dormant in these walls. A low groan emanated from somewhere beneath the floor, not the sound of settling pipes or foundation, but something organic. A sound of pain or rage that reverberated through the structure of the building itself. The cabinets began to shake, dishes rattling inside them. One by one, they opened as if an invisible hand was searching for something I needed to leave to escape whatever force had awakened in my apartment. I backed away from the kitchen, turning to flee toward the front door. The bloody writing on the wall expanded in my peripheral vision, more words appearing. Don't leave? I ignored the warning. Panic, overriding curiosity. As I crossed the living room, objects began flying from shelves. Books, decorative items, photographs landing with precision to block my path. The front door, still ajar from my entrance, slammed shut with such force that the wall shook. I lunged for the handle, yanking desperately, but it refused to budge. The temperature continued to drop until my fingers grew numb and my breath came in great white clouds. Ice crystals formed on the windows, spreading in fractal patterns that seemed to contain faces if viewed from certain angles. Faces twisted in expressions of agony or rage. A violent shudder ran through the entire apartment. Cracks appeared in the ceiling, spreading like lightning bolts across the plaster. From these fissures seeped a viscous, dark liquid that defied identification. Not blood, not water, but something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I pressed my back against the door, watching in horror as the liquid formed a growing puddle on my living room floor. Within its depths, I caught glimpses of movement of shapes that resembled human figures engaged in some frantic activity. The puddle expanded, stretching toward me with deliberate intent. My mind raced through possible explanations, each more outlandish than the last. Was I hallucinating from exhaustion? Had I been drugged? Somehow, was I actually asleep in my bed, trapped in a vivid nightmare? Or was something genuinely supernatural occurring? Some haunting or possession tied to this building's hidden past? The dark liquid stopped just short of my feet. Within its surface, images formed with greater clarity. I could see what appeared to be the basement of this very building. But from decades ago, men in old-fashioned clothing worked by lamplight, digging into the earth floor. In the center of their activity lay something partially unearthed, a box or container of some kind, ornately decorated with symbols I didn't recognize. The vision rippled and changed. Now I saw one man alone in the basement, hunched over the open box. He withdrew something that glinted in the lamplight, a knife with an unusual curved blade. The image blurred, then refocused to show the same man placing the knife inside the wall, sealing it behind a section of brick and mortar. His face turned toward me with impossible awareness. Across the decades, his expression one of desperate warning. The liquid retracted suddenly, flowing back toward the center of the room where it began to rise, coalescing into a roughly humanoid shape. It had no distinct features yet. Somehow conveyed a sense of malevolence so profound that I found myself sliding down the door to the floor, limbs weak with terror. The shape extended what might have been an arm, pointing first at me, then toward the kitchen. The message was unmistakable. There was something I needed to see. My body moved almost against my will, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The rational part of my mind had long since surrendered to. The impossible reality unfolding around me, I stepped carefully around the humanoid figure, which turned to follow my movement but made no attempt to stop me. In the kitchen, the bloody letters on the wall had changed again. Wall 3, B apartment, 3B, the elderly woman's unit. It was directly below mine. What was in her wall? The knife from my vision. Some other object connected to whatever tragedy had occurred here. I had nearly reached the kitchen when a thunderous pounding began at my front door. The sudden intrusion of normality into the supernatural tableau almost sent me to my knees with relief. A human presence, someone else to witness what was happening, to validate that I wasn't losing my mind. A voice called through the door. My neighbor from across the hall, concerned about the noise. He said he'd heard crashing sounds and wanted to check if everything was all right. His words reached me as if through water, distorted and distant. Before I could respond, the temperature in the apartment normalized abruptly. The dark liquid figure collapsed, soaking instantly into the floorboards without leaving a trace. The handprints on the kitchen wall vanished. Cabinet doors swung closed. The disarray in the living room, the thrown objects and books remained the only evidence that anything unusual had occurred. I glanced at my phone, finding the strange photograph gone, replaced by my normal lock screen. The cracks in the ceiling had vanished. I might have convinced myself I had experienced some sort of breakdown, if not for one remaining anomaly. The cutting board still lay on the counter, and the name Elas remained clearly visible in its scarred surface. I opened the front door to my concerned neighbor, assuring him I had simply knocked over a bookshelf while half asleep. He seemed skeptical, but accepted my explanation with a nod. As he turned to leave, he paused, asking if I had met the new tenant in 3B yet. My blood turned to ice. I asked what he meant. Wasn't an elderly woman living there? He looked at me strangely, telling me the old woman had moved out months ago. The apartment had been vacant until yesterday, when a young man moved in. He hadn't caught the new tenant's name yet. After my neighbor left, I stood in my doorway, staring at the now ordinary apartment. Everything appeared normal yet fundamentally changed. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever force had manifested tonight was connected not just to this building's past, but to its present as well. I should have packed a bag and left immediately. Any rational person would have fled. But curiosity mingled with my fear, a need to understand what had happened here, what continued to happen here. The name Elias, the mysterious object buried and then hidden in a wall, the new tenant in 3. B, these pieces formed a puzzle that both terrified and compelled me. I closed my door, this time making sure it locked properly. Tomorrow I would begin researching the history of this building, trying to uncover the truth about Elias and whatever tragedy had occurred here. Tonight, though, I would attempt to sleep, knowing that the walls around me contained secrets that wanted to be found, and that something ancient and patient was waiting for me to discover them, or perhaps had been waiting for me specifically all along. As I laid in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment was different now, fundamentally changed by what had transpired. Or perhaps it was I who had changed my perception, altered to finally see what had always been here, waiting in the spaces between what we consider reality. Whatever presence dwelled in this building had revealed itself to me for a reason, and in the quiet darkness of my bedroom I sensed it was still there, watching, waiting for me to take the next step in a journey that had been set in motion long before I ever signed my lease. Sleep did not come easily that night, nor did dreams when it finally arrived. Instead, I experienced fragments of memories that weren't my own, glimpses of this building in different eras of faces twisted in fear of a basement that contained something that should have remained buried, and through it all a whispered name, Elias. My alarm woke me at dawn. As consciousness returned, I noticed something on my bedside table that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. An old tarnished key with a tag attached. On the yellowed paper and faded ink, someone had written a single word beneath Story 3. The darkness in my apartment feels different tonight. Something watches me from the corner of my bedroom from behind the ornate frame of the antique mirror I purchased online last week. The sensation of eyes following my movements is unmistakable, like phantom fingertips trailing across my skin. When I look directly at the mirror, I see only my reflection, haggarded, sleep-deprived, increasingly paranoid. But in my peripheral vision, that reflection sometimes lingers a fraction of a second too long when I move. It's been 7 days since the package arrived, and I'm no longer certain. This apartment belongs entirely to me. The listing had described the mirror as a rare 17th century piece, allegedly recovered from an estate sale in Prague. Excellent condition. Despite its age, the description had claimed with only minor imperfections in the glass. What the seller failed to mention were the strange markings etched into the silvered surface, delicate, deliberate scratches forming symbols I didn't recognize. At first, I'd assumed they were just random damage, the inevitable result of centuries of handling. But as I cleaned the mirror that first afternoon, running a cloth over its surface, I realized the scratches formed a distinct pattern. Repeating in clusters along the mirror's perimeter, they resembled no alphabet I recognized. Yet they carried an undeniable intentionality, as if someone had used the glass to transcribe something urgently important. My fascination with antiques has always bordered on obsession. My apartment is filled with artifacts from different eras: Victorian writing desks, Art Deco lamps, Renaissance-inspired sculptures, each piece carrying its own history, but this mirror with its dark mahogany frame and clouded surface seemed to possess something beyond mere history. It had presence. That first night, after hanging it on my bedroom wall, I slept fitfully. I kept jolting awake with the unsettling sensation that someone was standing at the foot of my bed watching. Each time I opened my eyes, I saw only the mirror reflecting the dim outlines of my room. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that in the seconds before I awakened, someone or something had been there. By morning, I dismissed these impressions as nothing more than dreams. I got ready for work, avoiding looking directly at the mirror as I dressed, not consciously, but with the instinctive aversion prey develops to avoid predators. Only when I was at the door, keys in hand, did I notice something that made my blood run cold. The bronze bookend on my nightstand, shaped like a sphinx, had been moved. I distinctly remembered placing it on the left side of my small stack of books, yet now it sat on the right. I told myself I was mistaken. Memory plays tricks, especially when sleep is poor. I adjusted the bookend back to where I thought it belonged and left for work, pushing down the unease that had nestled in my chest. That evening, I returned to find the bookend moved again, now facing the opposite direction. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached it. Slowly, sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air. I glanced at the mirror, and for a flashing moment, so brief I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. I saw my reflection smiling, though my own face was frozen in fear. I considered removing the mirror. Then I even went so far as to lift it from its hook. But as I held it, my fingers tracing the strange symbols etched into its surface, I felt an inexplicable reluctance. Instead, I placed it in my closet facing the wall, wrapping it in an old blanket for good measure. That night, I dreamt of endless corridors lined with mirrors, each one showing a version of my apartment slightly different from the one I knew. In one reflection, the walls were a different color. In another, the furniture was arranged differently. In a third, shadowy figures moved in the background, their features indistinct but their movements purposeful. I woke gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat, my tongue dry and sticking to the roof of my mouth. The mirror was back on the wall. My hands trembled violently as I stared at it, trying to make sense of its reappearance. I couldn't have sleepwalked. I'd taken medication that should have knocked me out completely. Yet there it hung exactly where I'd first placed it. And now, in the pale morning light, I noticed something else. My bookshelf, normally filled with historical texts and art books, now contained several volumes I didn't recognize. Their spines were weathered leather, the titles embossed in those same strange symbols that marked the mirror's surface. I approached cautiously, my legs unsteady beneath me. When I pulled one of the unfamiliar books from the shelf, the leather felt warm, almost alive under my fingertips. The pages were filled with more of those incomprehensible symbols, interspersed with illustrations of creatures that seemed to shift and change as I tried to focus on them. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing so fast I feared it might burst from my chest. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick to breathe. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching ancient writing systems, hoping to identify the symbols. Hours bled into each other as I combed through websites, academic journals, and obscure forums. By evening, my eyes burned from staring at the screen, and I was no closer to answers. The closest match I found was to some Presumerian glyphs, but even those were only vaguely similar. When I finally looked up from my computer, I noticed the light in my apartment had changed. The usual warm yellow glow of my lamps had shifted to a cooler, bluer hue. I blinked several times, thinking my strained eyes were playing tricks, but the color remained altered. And now that I was paying attention, other details seemed wrong as well. The texture of my wooden floor appeared rougher, more organic somehow. The angles of the room's corners seemed slightly off, as if the walls were no longer perfectly perpendicular to each other. I approached the mirror again, drawn to it despite my growing dread. My reflection looked normal at first glance. Same tired eyes, same 3-day stubble, same expression of confused fear. But as I leaned closer, I noticed subtle differences. The collar of my reflection shirt was buttoned differently. The part in its hair fell on the opposite side. And when I raised my right hand, my reflection raised its right hand too. Not its left as it should have. I jerked backward, nearly tripping over my feet. My reflection remained standing where it was staring out at me with an expression that slowly morphed from fear to curiosity. My breath came in ragged gasps. I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears. I backed up until I hit the opposite wall, never taking my eyes off the mirror. For several minutes or perhaps hours, time seemed to lose meaning. We regarded each other, this other version of me and I. Finally, it turned and walked away, disappearing from the frame entirely. Though I remained pressed against the wall, I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen as far from the bedroom in the mirror as possible, with all the lights on and a knife clutched in my white-knuckled hand. Periodically, I heard sounds from the bedroom footsteps, the creak of floorboards, once the distinct sound of pages turning. Each noise sent a fresh wave of adrenaline coursing through my system until I felt hollowed out, my nerves raw and frayed. By morning, exhaustion had blunted the edge of my fear. I convinced myself that stress and sleep deprivation had caused me to hallucinate. Antiques were my passion, my livelihood. Surely I was letting my imagination run wild over a perfectly ordinary, if somewhat mysterious mirror. I decided to shower and head to work to reclaim some normalcy. The bathroom stopped me cold. The white tiles I'd installed just last year had been replaced with something that looked like stone but felt oddly soft and resilient under my bare feet. The shower curtain, formerly a plain beige, now displayed an intricate pattern of those same alien symbols from the mirror, and the mirror above the sink reflected a bathroom that wasn't quite mine. Similar in layout but wrong in almost every detail. I stumbled back to the kitchen, my unwashed hair plastered to my forehead with cold sweat. The knife I'd held all night now seemed pathetically inadequate against whatever was happening. I considered calling someone, a friend, the police, even the seller of the mirror. But what would I say that my reflection had a mind of its own, that my apartment was slowly transforming into something alien? I spent the day moving from room to room, cataloging the changes. Some were subtle. The grain of the wood on my dining table running in the wrong direction, the pattern on my curtains slightly altered. Others were more dramatic. My collection of vintage watches had been replaced by strange mechanical devices that ticked and whirred with no discernible purpose. The view from my windows showed a city skyline I recognized, but with buildings that shouldn't exist. Twisted spires and domes where there should have been rectangular skyscrapers. When I checked my phone, the interface was familiar but wrong. Icons in different places. Apps I didn't recognize with names written in those same symbols from the mirror. The few texts I received were garbled, the letters rearranging themselves as I tried to read them. I tried calling my sister, but the connection was full of static and a voice that wasn't hers. Answered, speaking words I couldn't understand. By evening, I'd retreated to my living room couch, which still felt relatively normal. I brought supplies, water, snacks, a flashlight, my now useless phone, and the knife, and created a small island of familiarity in an increasingly foreign space. The mirror remained in the bedroom, but I could feel its influence spreading throughout the apartment. The very air seemed different now, carrying scents I couldn't identify, metallic and organic. At the same time, I must have eventually succumbed to exhaustion because I woke with a start to find the apartment in darkness. The flashlight lay dead beside me. When I tried the light switch, nothing happened. Outside my windows, the city was dark as well, though pinpricks of light moved through the darkness in patterns no vehicle would make. In the perfect blackness, I became aware of sounds, soft footsteps moving through my apartment, the rustle of fabric, a low hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones rather than my ears. I remained perfectly still, barely breathing. As the sounds drew closer, a match flared in the darkness, briefly illuminating. A face identical to mine. My doppelganger stood just feet away, holding the small flame. In its light, I could see that he wore clothes similar to mine, but with subtle differences. The fabric appeared thicker, the cuts more angular. Around his neck hung an amulet bearing those now familiar symbols. The matchlight reflected in his eyes differently than it should have, creating an iridescence like oil on water. He studied me with an expression of detached curiosity, as one might observe an insect under glass. When he spoke, his voice was mine, but the cadence was wrong, the emphasis falling on unexpected syllables. He asked why I had summoned him if I was so afraid of the consequences. I shook my head, denying any intentional summoning. My voice cracked as I demanded to know what was happening to my home. He seemed genuinely surprised by my confusion. The mirror, he explained in that almost but not quite my voice, had been created centuries ago as a doorway between realities. The symbols etched into its surface were coordinates, directions to specific worlds among infinite possibilities. By acquiring the mirror, by tracing the symbols with my fingers as I cleaned it, I had activated the connection between our worlds. Now our realities were bleeding into each other, my world changing to match his perhaps taking on aspects of mine. The process once begun could not be easily reversed. Each reality would fight for dominance until one subsumed the other completely. My doppelganger didn't seem concerned. His world had absorbed others before. He had absorbed other versions of himself before. It was simply the nature of the mirror. Of all mirrors, really, they hungered for symmetry, for the merging of reflections with what was reflected. The match burned down, singing his fingers, but he didn't flinch. In the renewed darkness, I felt him sit beside me on the couch. His breathing matched mine perfectly. After a long silence, he suggested a compromise. We could exist together in a blended reality, neither fully his world nor mine. We could be neither fully him nor me, but something in between. I considered my options through the fog of fear and exhaustion. Fighting seemed pointless. How does one fight a shifting reality? Fleeing might be possible, but for how long if his world was consuming mine? Nowhere would remain untouched eventually. Before I could respond, I felt his hand cover mine. The sensation was bizarre, like touching my own hand. But from the outside, our fingers aligned perfectly, and where they touched, I could no longer tell which were his and which were mine. The distinction seemed suddenly meaningless. This morning, I sit at what was once my desk writing this account. The apartment around me is neither fully mine nor entirely foreign. The walls pulse slightly with each breath I take, whether they're breathing or I am. I can no longer say with certainty. Outside, the sky is a color I have no name for. The mirror hangs on the wall before me, but it no longer shows a reflection. Instead, it offers glimpses of other realities, other possibilities, some nearly identical to my original world, others wildly different. Sometimes I see other versions of myself looking back, their expressions ranging from horror to curiosity to envy. I understand the mirror now. It doesn't create connections between worlds. It reveals the connections that were always there. Reality is more permeable than we imagine. The boundaries between possibilities, thinner than we'd like to believe. I trace the symbols etched into the mirror's surface. They no longer seem foreign to me. I recognize them as the true alphabet of existence, the language in which all possible worlds are written. With each symbol I touch, I feel realities shift and merge. I'm not who I was when I first unwrapped that mirror. But then again, who remains unchanged by the things they bring into their homes, the artifacts they surround themselves with? We are all in our way, collectors of experiences that transform us. The difference is merely one of degree. I hear footsteps approaching. My footsteps, though I'm sitting still, I don't turn around. There's no need, I already know exactly what I'll see. Story 4, I still remember the exact moment everything changed for me. The sun was already sinking behind the library's tall gray walls, casting elongated shadows across the campus courtyard. There was a chill in the air, an unsettling hush that made my skin prickle. Even then, something about the atmosphere felt unnervingly wrong. It's hard to describe, but if I had to choose a word, I'd call it invasive, a growing sense that 1,000 invisible eyes were watching, waiting. I should have turned around and left, but of course I didn't. My office light was the only one still burning on the third floor, and I had a deadline to meet. I am a professor of ancient history specializing in obscure languages no one else bothers to study. For most of my academic life, that niche has been my pride and joy, a doorway into worlds forgotten by time. I often joke that dusty tomes and indecipherable scripts were my only companions on a Friday night. But in the last few weeks, these unearly lines of text became something else entirely. No longer innocent puzzles to be solved, but a path leading me directly into something terrifying. I had come into possession of an artifact rumored to date back to a lost civilization. The stone tablet was riddled with peculiar runes I hadn't seen in any known alphabets. Initially, I felt a thrill at the prospect of deciphering it. Yet almost immediately, I noticed strange occurrences. At first, they were small. Papers on my desk rearranged themselves. The light in my office flickered erratically, Even though maintenance insisted there was nothing wrong with the wiring, I assumed the stress of my workload was messing with my mind. Then I began to receive anonymous notes. They appeared out of nowhere on my desk, and my mailbox even slipped beneath my office door. The language on those scraps of parchment was the same as the one on the artifact. I could read only a few symbols at first, but every time I deciphered more, a wave of unease swept through my body. My heart would pound, my palms would sweat, and I felt like I was being swallowed by a darkness I couldn't see but could definitely sense. Soon I realized I wasn't alone. Whenever I looked out my window, I would glimpse a silhouette in the distance, a tall, lean shadow that seemed to shift its posture the instant I laid eyes on it. The figure lingered far enough away that I couldn't distinguish its features yet, close enough to make me feel intensely watched. I mentioned this to a colleague in passing, describing it as a possible campus security issue. He turned to see for himself, but the moment he looked, the figure vanished. He made a remark about me working too late, cautioning that stress might be playing tricks on my vision. I forced a laugh and agreed, but deep down I knew something sinister was at play. In the following days, I noticed the figure more often. It was always a dark shape lurking at the periphery of my vision. Sometimes outside the classroom window, sometimes at the end of a hallway, sometimes even on the reflection of a glass case in the library's special collections area. But anytime I tried to show someone else, it was as though the shape evaporated into thin air. My heart rate would spike with a sudden jolt of primal fear. Beads of sweat dampening my temples, I found myself breathing faster, shoulders tense, ready to sprint without knowing exactly where to go. I tried to capture proof. I snapped photos from my phone, hoping that if I documented the figure, I wouldn't feel like I was losing my mind. The initial images showed nothing unusual, but after several attempts, I began noticing a curious blot in the pictures, a smudge of perfect blackness that looked out of place. With each new photo, that blot seemed a bit larger, a bit closer, as though it were creeping toward me in incremental steps. My stomach churned each time I reviewed those images on my computer. My throat grew tight, and I had to keep swallowing to push down the sickening dread that bubbled up. When I finally confided in a trusted mentor, I spoke indirectly about feeling stalked. I might have been vague, but I asked if he ever heard of other scholars facing harassment when researching artifacts. He recalled a rumor one about an earlier professor who had studied a similar stone. That academic, he'd said, claimed to be haunted by nightmarish visions, but no one took him seriously, attributing his stories to fatigue. He eventually took a sabbatical and never returned to research the artifact. My mentor suggested I consider a rest too if my nerves were truly frayed. I nodded in silent agreement, though I knew I wouldn't abandon my work. This was more than just stress. Something real was happening. Every night I stayed later in my office than I should have. The building was eerily silent after dark. Each footstep echoed through the corridor in a sharp clack, and every squeak of the old radiator made me jump. The overhead fluorescents cast a weak, flickering glow that left corners shrouded in near blackness. I often felt a presence just beyond my field of vision, like the silhouette was creeping behind the half-open doors or leaning against the rows of book-laden shelves waiting for me to drop my guard. My skin tingled, goosebumps rising whenever I convinced myself I sensed a cool draft. Even though every window was closed one evening while poring over the runes on the artifact, I realized I recognized a handful of characters. They resembled an obscure form of proto-crypt from a civilization rumored to practice shadow worship. Translations hinted at a being described as a devourer of dread, a predator drawn to scholars who delved too deeply into its origins. My chest tightened as I read these words. A profound terror settled in my gut, so intense I had to remind myself to breathe. I wiped sweat from my forehead, feeling my pulse throb in my neck. My mouth went dry and my hands trembled so much I nearly dropped my notes. Over the following week, my nightmares intensified. I was plagued by images of long hallways that narrowed until I felt trapped. And in each nightmare, there was that silhouette always standing at the far end. Then, without moving its legs, it would glide closer. I'd wake up gasping, heart hammering, as if I just sprinted a mile. certain that someone was in my bedroom, but when I turned on the light, I'd find nothing, only the deafening pound of my blood rushing in my ears. One morning, I found a fresh note taped to the artifact's case. The ancient script was now terrifyingly clear to me: feast fear forever. As I read it, I felt a surge of vertigo, as though the floor had tilted beneath my feet. My breath hitched. I tried to calm myself, rubbing my clammy hands against my slacks, but it was no use. My body felt hijacked by adrenaline. I decided to do more thorough research on any references to this so-called devourer of dread. I dug into dusty archives, searching for testimonies, diaries, anything that might explain how to ward it off. Buried in a neglected binder, I found scattered notes from a professor who had vanished from academia decades ago. They contained warnings, references to an unseen shadow that follows the curious to nightmares, of a shape that grows more defined with each frightened gasp. According to these notes, the entity was drawn to the vulnerability of those who glimpsed its existence. The more they believed in it, the stronger it became. I couldn't decide if the revelation was a relief or the final push into panic. On one hand, it confirmed I wasn't losing my mind. There truly was an entity haunting my steps. On the other hand, it meant I was in actual danger. My heart raced as I realized the more fear I felt, the closer it crept. I began to avoid looking out the windows, worried I'd see that silhouette inching nearer, feeding on my every jolt of terror. Yet I couldn't just ignore it. I was stuck in a cycle. The more I feared it, the more real it became. The more real it became, the more terrified I was. Despite my better judgment, I confided indirectly in a small circle of academics, describing the sense of being watched and the black blot in the photos. They seemed skeptical but politely concerned. One or two offered to accompany me to my office, though they laughed off the notion of a supernatural stalker. Whenever we tried taking pictures together, that blot never appeared. Of course it didn't. It thrived on my fear, not theirs. It wasn't long before paranoia seeped into every aspect of my life. I started double-checking locks. I refused to spend time alone in my office after sundown. Yet I couldn't stop working on the translation, compelled by a strange mixture of dread and fascination. My typically organized mind became a jumble of obsessive thoughts. I saw the silhouette shape in coat racks, shadows on the walls, even on passing cars at night. I'd snap my head around heart-pounding breath coming in shallow, raspy gulps, only to discover it was nothing. Or maybe it was something I just couldn't prove. One particularly tense evening, I was sifting through my notes in the campus library. The lights were dim, the place practically deserted. Only the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant echo of footsteps from a single security guard interrupted the dense silence. That was when I heard it. The slow creak of a chair somewhere behind the towering shelves. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. I froze, bracing myself, my pulse beating so loudly in my ears that it nearly drowned out everything else. I told myself to remain calm, to treat the sound as a normal occurrence in an old building, maybe a settling floorboard. Still, I stood and crept around the aisle, scanning for any sign of that silhouette. My legs trembled as I advanced, every step careful and slow. Each breath felt too loud, an unwanted signal of my presence. My hands grew clammy, the page I was holding damp from my sweat. When I finally turned a corner, I saw no sign of anyone. My exhalation was shaky, more relief than anything else. But as I glanced at the nearest study table, I noticed an item that didn't belong there. A single scrap of the same parchment I'd been receiving, covered with that ancient script. I swallowed hard, aware of my heart slamming in my ribcage like a trapped animal. I forced myself to pick up the note, feeling its brittle texture under my shaking fingertips. The writing was clear. It grows stronger each time you tremble. I nearly dropped it in horror. My mouth went so dry that my tongue felt like sandpaper. Staggering back, I clutched my chest, trying to steady my ragged breathing. I had to leave immediately. On my way out, I caught sight of my reflection in the library's glass entrance. At first, it was just me, pale-faced eyes wild with fear. Then I noticed a sliver of darkness at my shoulder, a shape that wasn't mine. I spun around, but nothing was there. The jolt of panic that coursed through me was almost too much to bear. Back at my apartment, I locked the door and dragged a heavy bookcase in front of it as if that could keep out a being that thrived on fear itself. That night, I stayed awake flipping through the old professor's notes over and over, searching for any clue on how to rid myself of this nightmare. As the hours ticked by, I came across a passage that mentioned confrontation, a type of ritual or mental stance that required acknowledging the entity without succumbing to its terror. The text was fragmented, but the implication was that one must face it directly and reject the fear, refusing to feed it further. The next day, I returned to my office mindset on forcing a confrontation. My heart drummed so fiercely that I thought I might faint. I closed the blinds, leaving only the cold, artificial light above to illuminate the space. Setting the artifact on my desk, I read the inscription out loud, my voice trembling. Then I demanded that the entity reveal itself. My entire body was in a cold sweat and my voice cracked, but I repeated the demand again. The silence around me felt like a living thing, thick and suffocating. I half expected the silhouette to materialize right then, but nothing happened. Instead, a wave of crushing dread washed over me, dizzying in its intensity. I fought to steady my breath, repeating in my mind that I wouldn't let it feed off me. I told myself that if this devourer of dread existed, I would starve it, refusing to surrender another ounce of my fear. Anxiety radiated through my arms and legs, and I clenched my fists until my knuckles turned white. My stomach churned, but I pushed onward, grinding my teeth to avoid shouting in panic. That was when I glimpsed the figure in the mirror on the wall, darker than a moonless night, towering and static. My heart pounded so violently I felt it might burst, but I maintained focus on the reflection. My entire body was rigid with tension, and each inhale felt as though a vice gripped my lungs. I had to remind myself to hold steady, to draw in breath, to challenge the hold this thing had on my psyche. I can't say how long I stood there, seconds, minutes. The figure made no move, but the intensity of its presence was almost unbearable. At some point, I realized I was repeating in a ragged whisper that I was not afraid. My voice wavered, but I persisted. I stared into that mirror, refusing to look away, refusing to succumb. My heart thundered in my chest and sweat dripped down my temple, but I kept asserting again and again that it had no power unless I gave it power. Eventually, the pressure in the room lessened, almost as if the atmosphere eased. The figure's outline seemed to blur. My muscles shook from the effort of standing my ground, but I sensed I was gaining a fragile sort of advantage. I can't claim a dramatic vanishing occurred. Instead, the silhouette flickered like a fading projection, and the space behind me returned to normal. I sank to my chair, drenched in perspiration. Breathing in heaves, I felt lightheaded, battered, yet oddly triumphant. In the following days, I noticed I could still sense something lingering at the edges of my awareness. The difference was that it felt weaker. I would catch fleeting glimpses, a hint of darkness in a photograph or a flicker at the corner of my eye. But the entity no longer felt so overwhelming. Each time I noticed it, I forced myself to remain calm, to slow my breathing. My heart still raced, but I kept my reaction in check, determined not to feed it more. Gradually those sightings diminished. I placed the artifact in a secure vault in the university's special collections, accompanied by notes, warning future researchers of its potential danger. Though I suspect most will scoff at those warnings, at least no one can say I didn't try. I ceased receiving the strange messages and my sense of being watched subsided. Still, I can't claim I'm completely free. There are nights when I wake to the echo of a distant creak or a whisper of wind that chills my sweat-soaked skin. My heart will slam with fear before I can even open my eyes. In those moments, I remind myself that I fought back once I refused to indulge that primal terror. Yet a part of me knows it never fully disappeared. It's simply waiting, lurking beyond the fragile barrier of my resolve, biding its time until it senses the faintest crack in my courage. That knowledge keeps me on edge, fueling the uneasy feeling that any day, any hour it might return. I don't think it's gone forever, It merely lost its hold when I stopped feeding its insatiable appetite for dread. There's a profound discomfort in living with that awareness, an underlying paranoia that gnaws at the edges of my daily life. When I glance at my reflection, I'm never completely sure if I see only myself in the glass. My nerves fray at small noises, and my hands still tremble whenever I recall the smudge in the photographs that drew closer with each shot. Even now, I work hard to keep my composure. I cling to the hope that by staying resolute, I deny it the sustenance it craves. But I can't forget the words etched on that parchment. It grows stronger each time you tremble. There is no closure, no neat conclusion. Its presence might fade, but it's never far. And knowing that is perhaps the worst sort of torment. It's a silent vow that all it would take is one slip a night of worry, a single instant of unguarded fear for it to come surging back blacker and hungrier than ever before. So I remain vigilant, living with the quiet but relentless awareness that the shadow is still out there haunting the corners of my mind. And though I manage to escape its full wrath, I feel a persistent chill whenever I think of it, as though it's breathing down my neck, just one terrifying heartbeat away. Story 5. I felt the chill the moment I stepped onto the cracked stone path leading up to the old farmhouse. The air seemed unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. My heart started beating faster as I surveyed the dark outline of the structure before me. Moonlight glinted off warped windows, hinting at shapes lurking behind the glass. The weathered wood of the porch groaned under the weight of decades, and the very atmosphere felt charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. The property caretaker had insisted this was a routine assignment: document an aging historic piece of rural architecture for a heritage project. Yet something in my gut warned me there was nothing routine about what lay ahead. Even before crossing the threshold, I sensed a deep pulsing wrongness beneath the quiet facade. It clung to my skin like stale smoke and made every hair on my neck stand on end. I'm a photographer by trade, and I've been to dozens of isolated locations. I've crouched in crumbling cathedrals, tiptoed through abandoned factories, and braved creaking mansions that looked like they'd fold in on themselves if the wind blew too hard. But this place felt different. There was an uncanny presence in the air, almost like another consciousness hovered just beyond my peripheral vision, observing me. My camera bag felt heavier on my shoulder than usual, and my breath was already growing ragged from an intangible anxiety. The caretaker had offered to accompany me, but he seemed unnerved by the property himself. After some cursory instructions about the interior mumbled more like a warning than a welcome, he merely pointed me toward the door and stayed in his truck. The single direct piece of advice he managed was a barely audible mutter: "Make sure you keep track of where you've been." That was it. Then he gripped the steering wheel, stared straight ahead, and refused to say another word. I took a deep breath and walked inside alone. The moment I passed through the threshold, I felt disoriented, like the house itself had shifted in some fundamental way. Instead of seeing a single long corridor or the open layout, I had anticipated I was met with a cavernous foyer. Old oil lamps flickered along the walls, casting an uneven glow. My hands were clammy, and I quickly scanned the area for any sign of modern lighting. There was a switch by the door, but flipping it did nothing. The dim glow of those lamps seemed to come from some era before electricity, and the heavy drapes layered in dust suggested no one had drawn them aside in many years. Something else caught my attention: a low whisper of wind, although the windows were all closed. It slithered through the hall, brushing against my ears like a hushed warning. There was no draft, no open vent. Yet the hush rattle sound persisted, making my pulse pound against my temples. I tried to focus on the assignment, photographing each room in detail. Lifting my camera to my face provided a small sense of professional detachment, a reminder that I was here to work. Yet when I snapped my first picture, the flash illuminated something that did not belong. For a split second, I swore I saw a figure at the end of the foyer, a man in old-fashioned clothes glaring at me as though I'd intruded on a private moment. The flash died and the corridor was empty again. My legs turned shaky and sweat trickled down my brow. I reminded myself I had a job to do. Ghostly illusions sometimes happen when you're on edge in a creepy environment, or so I tried to convince myself. As I moved deeper into the property, the house itself seemed to morph around me. In one room, the wallpaper was bright and fresh as though newly hung. The furniture had a gleaming polish, and there was a distinct smell of lemon oil, but the very next room felt like stepping into a different century. The walls were stained with age. The floorboards creaked with each step, and an antique photograph stood in the corner, covered in dust, so thick it looked like gray fur. My camera lens captured these bizarre inconsistencies. One frame showing a tidy, almost pristine parlor from some distant era, the next revealing a neglected sitting room that seemed to exist decades apart from the previous one. My mind reeled as I flipped through the digital previews. It made no sense, and that creeping dread intensified. My heart hammered and my breath started coming out in uneven gasps. That was when I first noticed the apparitions. At first, they flickered at the edges of my vision, fleeting shapes that vanished if I tried to look directly at them. But as I followed a narrow staircase to the second floor, I began to see them more clearly. One was a woman in a tattered dress pacing by a window. Although I never heard her voice, I could sense her anguish as she clutched a necklace and turned it over in her hands again and again, repeating the motion like she was trapped in some endless loop of torment. Another figure dressed in work clothes spattered with mud seemed to be locked in an argument with someone unseen, gesticulating wildly and stomping around a bedroom whose furnishings changed styles whenever I blinked. The house resonated with these silent testimonies of sorrow, and each new room felt like stepping into a living nightmare curated from different times. I wanted desperately to leave, but every corridor led to another disorienting space that made less and less sense. When I attempted to return to the foyer, I found a hallway in its place that hadn't been there before. My skin prickled and my stomach dropped. I broke into a cold sweat, stumbling forward while feeling like the walls themselves were pressing in on me. My camera strap cut into my shoulder and my breath hissed through clenched teeth. Dread was taking hold in a very physical way, constricting my lungs. My heart pounded so loudly it overshadowed the rhythmic creaking of old floors beneath my feet. I tried to retrace my steps, but every door I opened revealed a new part of the house, each room a different slice of history. The rickety boards of a 19th century kitchen gave way to a 1920s-style library with Art Deco lamps, which then transitioned into a Victorian-era bedroom with heavy velvet drapes. The transitions made my head throb. Several times I thought I heard faint echoes of voices. They drifted through the walls, murmuring in arguments or pleas, but so muffled that they never became coherent. Occasionally a phrase would snap into clarity, some anxious exclamation or desperate phrase, but it would slip away as soon as I tried to latch onto it. My skin crawled whenever I caught the outlines of these ghostly tenants moving about in the rooms. None of them looked at me directly, but their presence gnawed at my sanity. Each spirit seemed unaware of my intrusion, yet I sensed they existed for the sole purpose of replaying their torment in an endless cycle. The further I went, the more the concept of time unraveled. My watch displayed impossible readings, jumping forward and backward. The house's corridors stretched in serpentine paths that defied logic. And I found myself looping around to the same spot, except it wasn't the same. The furnishings would be different. The paintings on the walls altered, and a new oppressive darkness would settle over everything. My throat felt parched, and a dull ache blossomed behind my eyes. The persistent hum of tension in my chest became almost unbearable, and I caught myself trembling. I had to steady my camera more than once because my hand shook too violently to take a clean shot. In one particularly eerie moment, I stepped into a cramped study bathed in the weak glow of an oil lamp. The temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my own breath materializing in front of me. My heart raced. A figure lingered at an old writing desk, scribbling furiously on parchment. There was a tangible sense of despair emanating from him as he hunched over his shoulders, quaking with silent sobs. I approached cautiously, but as soon as I was within a few feet, the lamp flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. My mouth went dry and my scalp tingled. I flailed for the doorknob, nearly dropping my camera as panic surged through me. When I finally managed to turn the knob, I stumbled into another corridor entirely and the study was gone. A nauseating realization gripped me. Every attempt to leave this maze of temporal confusion only drew me deeper into it. The caretaker's warning echoed in my mind and I cursed under my breath. My sense of direction had become hopelessly twisted. The floors groaned like they were mocking me and the walls felt alive. Shifting in the corner of my vision whenever I wasn't looking directly at them, I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, and a clammy layer of sweat clung to the back of my neck. Occasionally, I had the distinct sensation of being watched by an invisible presence just over my shoulder. More than once, I whipped around Hart, lurching only to see empty space or a swirl of dust motes drifting in the faint light. Desperate to orient myself, I decided to take photographs at each junction. The camera's flash illuminated the gloom, giving me brief glimpses of the layout, but reviewing the pictures only made things worse. The digital preview showed corridors I didn't remember walking through, angles that defied the house's supposed architecture. And in the corners of some frames, I saw tall silhouettes that definitely were not in the shot. When I pressed the shutter, panic clawed at my insides. My breath turned into shallow gasps and my hands quivered with growing intensity. I began to suspect that the house had its own will. Each room I entered felt like a deliberate choice on its part, guiding me deeper into scenes of heartbreak. In one suite, thick with the scent of old perfume, I witnessed two ghostly figures, one on the bed and another pacing near the door, locked in a heartbreaking argument. Though their voices were faint, I picked up the tension in their posture and the repetitive gestures of frustration. The atmosphere pressed down on me like an anvil, suffocating me with an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Yet there was no sign of actual physical harm, just an unending loop of despair that made my chest tighten as if I couldn't get enough air. In another chamber, which looked like a sunroom from the 1800s, the furniture was overturned in disarray, and a spectral form seemed to be searching frantically for something, patting the tables and rummaging through drawers that were stuck in time. The figure's distress was palpable, yet it never found what it sought, repeating the same cycle over and over. My stomach lurched and sweat dribbled down my temple. I wanted to shout at it to do anything to break the loop, but no words left my mouth. Instead, I turned and ran my footsteps, echoing louder and louder until they sounded like thunder in my own ears. Despite my terror, I realized that I had to find a way out methodically. The caretaker's advice to keep track of where I'd been might be my only chance. Summoning the last shred of composure, I tried marking walls with chalk from my camera bag. But every time I retraced my path, the marks were gone, or the walls themselves had changed into different materials, stone plaster wood from a different era. My heart sank and a wave of dizzying fear washed over me. I felt a surge of claustrophobia. My breathing turned shallow and fast, making me lightheaded. The flickering lights combined with the swirling sense of being trapped in a loop of nightmares made me question my sanity. I wondered if I was hallucinating, or if the property had genuinely ensnared me in its timeless web. At some point, I reached a tiny corridor illuminated by a single lantern. The flickering flame cast wild shadows on the walls. My pulse pounded, but a small part of me dared to hope that maybe this was some exit. I moved forward cautiously, each footstep coinciding with a thunderous hammering in my chest. The corridor ended at a simple wooden door with iron hinges. I gripped the handle, noticing how cold the metal felt against my sweaty palm. Summoning every bit of courage, I twisted and pushed. To my shock, I emerged back into the foyer, yet it was not quite the same foyer I'd first seen. The wallpaper was a different color. The shape of the banister had changed, and the windows were boarded up. But the front door was there. I rushed toward it, heart drumming like a wild animal trapped in a cage. My breath turned ragged, and I realized I was on the verge of hyperventilating. With trembling hands, I fumbled at the lock and managed to pry the door open. I half expected to see another corridor or an alien landscape from some bygone century. Instead, the night air welcomed me. I was back outside. I nearly collapsed on the porch, taking in great gulps of fresh air. My entire body shook and my legs felt weak as though I had run for miles. I could feel the surge of adrenaline making my heart race so hard that it hurt. The caretaker's truck was gone. I saw only my own car parked under the moonlight. It looked somehow duller, as though it too had weathered a different passage of time. With trembling fingers, I slid into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. My chest felt tight and hot. I wiped sweat from my brow, started the engine, and quickly reversed out of the driveway, not caring about the scrapes of gravel as I sped away from that cursed property. Even as I tore down the rural road, glancing in the rearview mirror made my throat clench. The old farmhouse stood in silent silhouette against the moonlit sky, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a faint glow in one of the top floor windows. It felt like the house was watching me leave. My heart thudded in my chest. I forced my eyes back on the road, my hands damp on the steering wheel. An uneasy sense of relief weared with the lingering dread that I hadn't truly escaped. My mind replayed every corridor, every haunting figure, every locked tragedy I'd witnessed. They all remained suspended in that labyrinth of shifting time, and a nauseating thought festered in my brain. What if I had brought something back with me? I didn't stop until I reached the nearest motel hours later. When I finally dared to look at my camera's memory card, I discovered many of my photos were corrupted. Strange distortions marred the images, or entire frames were gone as if they had never existed. Yet a few pictures remained bizarrely intact, clearly showing glimpses of different eras. In one, a hallway featured an ornate gas lamp. In another, the same hallway boasted electric sconces. Some pictures included faint silhouettes standing in corners or by windows. None of them looked directly at the camera, but the tension in their posture made me shudder. My hands shook so hard I dropped the camera on the motel bed, my breath catching in my throat. I pressed my palms to my eyelids, trying to steady myself. I was out. I had escaped. Yet a part of me felt strangely incomplete, as if the house's labyrinth had only allowed me a temporary reprieve. My skin still crawled with the memory of the swirling corridors, the silent ghosts lost in unbreakable loops of sorrow. My head pounded as I recalled the caretaker's ominous warning, and I wondered if he knew exactly what I would find. If so, why had he allowed me to walk in there alone? To this day, I can't be sure if everything I experienced was real or some elaborate hallucination triggered by the property's oppressive atmosphere, but I have the photos, fragmented proof of impossible rooms and intangible figures. Sometimes I dream about that place, and in my dreams the corridors stretch on forever, each door opening onto another epic of unending despair. I wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, mouth dry. The sense of being watched lingers as I stare at my bedroom walls, reminding me that some nightmares don't vanish with daylight. I haven't set foot on another remote property since. The thought of exploring any old structure makes my stomach twist with an unshakable dread. Yet a perverse curiosity sometimes nags at me, urging me to return to see if I could find a way to help those trapped souls, or document the shifting timelines more thoroughly. But then I remember the suffocating sensation of that farmhouse, the feeling that the walls themselves were alive, conspiring to swallow me whole, and I know I will never ever go back. My escape was real enough. The memory of that darkness is permanent. Even if I managed to flee physically, a piece of me stayed behind in that shifting maze of time, and no amount of distance will ever truly separate me from it. Story 6, I arrived at the house in the late afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was how the sunlight seemed to recoil from the windows, even as I walked up the cracked steps. My chest tightened with a sensation of inexplicable dread. The wind hissed through the tall, spindly pines surrounding the property like a swarm of whispering onlookers. My pulse pounded against my ribs, and for a moment I thought I could hear it echo in the empty rooms inside. Despite that strange, foreboding atmosphere, I told myself I needed solitude to finish my manuscript. That had been the entire point of renting this isolated place. No neighbors, no distractions. I hoped the thick walls would shut out the world until I could wrestle the story from my mind and onto the page. Stepping inside, I noticed an immediate drop in temperature. My breath caught in my throat and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The house looked clean enough. Nothing obviously wrong, but something in the stale air made me swallow hard. Every floorboard groaned in protest under my weight as though it resented my presence. My heart thumped a little faster with each step, my eyes flicking to the corners where the shadows seemed to gather like silent sentinels. The realtor had mentioned something about a few quirks in the property's history, but I had shrugged it off as local superstition. Now, with my heart racing and a thin film of sweat forming on my forehead, I regretted not asking more questions. The first few days passed in quiet, though I felt on edge whenever I sat down to write. The house was just so silent. Whenever I typed a word, the keystrokes echoed through the halls. My own breathing sounded deafening in the hush. Still, the isolation worked wonders for my productivity. At first, paragraphs formed quickly and I could immerse myself in the twisted plot of my novel. It was supposed to be a psychological thriller filled with shifting walls and hidden spaces. Imagine doorways that led unsuspecting characters into horrifying encounters with their own fears. I remember feeling a surge of excitement when I added a scene involving a hidden door behind an old arm wire. The protagonist in my story pried the door open to discover a dark corridor lit only by flickering candles. That same night, I woke with my heart pounding. The house was pitch black. No clock, no street lights, nothing to break the darkness. My breath came in ragged puffs and I felt a trickle of sweat rolling down my temple. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it struck me I was alone in that secluded house. My tongue felt dry and my palms were clammy. I forced myself to get up to fetch a glass of water from the kitchen. My footsteps echoed down the hallway and every nerve in my body screamed that I was not alone. The floor creaked behind me, but when I spun around, all I saw was emptiness. My heart hammered harder than ever. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from making any noise that might betray my fear. After flipping on the kitchen light, I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breathing. Eventually, my pulse slowed and I managed to convince myself it was just nerves. The house was old, I told myself, and old houses have a tendency to complain in the night. But the next morning, as I walked past one of the rooms at the end of the main hallway, I noticed the furniture had been rearranged in a way that I did not remember doing. There was an armchair angled strangely near the wall, and behind it was a new addition, a tall, upright cabinet. I blinked, struggling to recall if it had always been there. My skin broke out in goosebumps when I realized it looked almost exactly like the ancient armoire I'd just written into my manuscript. My mouth went dry and I approached it with reluctant, trembling steps. Every inch of me wanted to run, yet I found myself pulling at the small brass handle. Heart slamming in my chest as I discovered it was locked. My immediate thought was that I must have conjured this memory from childhood, or perhaps I had written a detail I'd once seen somewhere else, and now my imagination was playing tricks. But it was so tangible. I swear I could smell the scent of old wood dust and something damp lingering around it. A chill seeped into my bones as I stood there uncertain what to do. The rest of the day I tried to focus on writing, but each time I typed a new sentence, my eyes would flick over to the hallway as if expecting something else to materialize. My breathing was shallow and my neck felt stiff from tension. Even blinking felt like a risk, as if I might miss the next impossible change if I allowed my eyes to close for too long. In the days that followed, the changes became more pronounced when I described a narrow staircase in one of my chapters. I woke up the next morning to find an unfamiliar stairwell near the back of the house leading down into a basement I could have sworn did not exist. My pulse roared in my ears as I tested the steps. They groaned and wobbled under my weight, making me dizzy with the sense that reality itself was morphing around me. The basement floor was cold concrete and the musty smell made me gag. My hands shook with the urge to run back upstairs and pretend I hadn't seen any of it. But I forced myself to walk around shining a flashlight into the corners. I thought I heard faint whispering, but the words were indistinct, more like an echo of conversation drifting through the walls. My heart hammered so loudly that I could feel it in my throat, and the air felt thick, suffocating as if it clung to my skin. I began to suspect the house was feeding off my creativity. Everything I wrote seemed to manifest in some physical form. If I described a candlelit corridor, I might find the flickering glow of an unseen flame dancing across a wall at midnight. If I described a door that was always locked, I would stumble on a sealed entrance somewhere in the living room, my breath hitching at the impossibility of it. I could feel the sweat beating on my forehead every time I sat down to write. My stomach knotted with a growing sense of dread, but a disturbing curiosity kept me going. The story was coming together in an almost effortless way, and part of me couldn't help but be fascinated by the phenomenon. Another part of me, the part that clenched my jaw and made my hands tremble, was terrified of the cost. During one of my late night writing sessions, I wrote about a character who wandered the hallways at night, whispering secrets to anyone who would listen. I hadn't planned the scene, it just flowed out of me in a surge of creative energy. Soon after, I started hearing hushed voices in the corridors after midnight. My heart would race and I'd break out in cold sweats, too afraid to open my bedroom door. The voices were close, just on the other side of the wood, sometimes in rapid conversation, sometimes calling my name in a half-heard rasp. I'd press my hands over my ears, but the faint murmurs persisted, worming into my thoughts. One evening, I mustered enough courage to open the door, flashlight in hand, determined to catch a glimpse. The corridor was empty except for shifting shadows cast by the moonlight, yet the whispering continued just out of reach, as if mocking my fear. By the end of the second week, I could barely sleep. My body was constantly braced for the next unsettling discovery. My heart would skip, beats sending jolts of electric panic through my chest. I'd wake up gasping for air, convinced I heard something moving in the attic or rattling the windows. Every night I'd break into a sweat, feeling pinned by the oppressive darkness. My neck and shoulders were perpetually tense, and even my hands began to tremble. Whenever I sat down at the keyboard, I questioned my sanity repeatedly, wondering if maybe I'd lost my grip on what was real and what was fiction. It felt like I was living inside my own novel, blurring the lines between my nightmares and my waking life. Sometimes I'd imagine the house as a living entity, devouring each word I wrote and spitting it back into the architecture. It was a parasite feeding on my creativity until there was no barrier left between my thoughts and my surroundings. When I tried to resist, when I avoided writing for a day or two, I found new passages scrolled in my notebook lines. I couldn't recall typing. My mouth would go dry reading them. The descriptions matched additions to the house that I hadn't yet discovered. A rotting staircase in the attic, a hidden room behind the kitchen wall, a locked trunk in the closet. Each new detail quickened my pulse, leaving me shaking with an unspoken dread of what I might find next. One evening, I caught the faintest reflection in the window, a figure standing behind me just for a second. My muscles seized up and I spun around so quickly that I nearly toppled the chair. No one was there, but the fear that coursed through me left me panting, hard-hammering hands slick with sweat. Later that night, I thought I heard footsteps right outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate. My entire body trembled in the darkness, and my mind conjured images of the very characters I had crafted come to life to haunt me. They were no longer confined to my imagination. They were creeping through the halls, searching for me. A sheen of cold sweat covered my back, and I found myself unable to move, pinned by terror. Sleep became a fragmented series of jolts and gasps, interrupted by phantom noises and flickering lights. I'd wake at random hours, nails digging into my palms, my heart pounding so hard it made my vision blur. I stopped writing, but it didn't stop the house from shifting. When I ventured out of my room, I'd discover new doors, new corners, new murmurs drifting through the walls. The sense of being watched never left me. I felt eyes on me in the shower, in the living room, even in the kitchen where the windows were boarded up for reasons I never understood. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I had to leave. My mind was on the brink of collapse, and my body felt drained from constant anxiety. The simplest plan, packing up and driving away, seemed nearly impossible. The night before I intended to go, I experienced the worst episode yet. I woke up to the sound of scratching inside the walls. My breath caught in my chest, and I felt a wave of nausea, clawing, scraping as if something was trying to break free from the other side of the plaster. My skin prickled and my heart thudded like a drumbeat in my ears. I didn't dare leave the safety of my bed, but I could feel the vibrations traveling through the wooden frame. Cold sweats licked my arms and drenched my shirt. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, but the sound persisted, fraying what was left of my nerves. The next morning, I pulled my suitcase from the closet and started stuffing it with clothes and notes. Everything in me felt on edge, as if the house itself was an extension of my own anxiety. My hands shook so badly I dropped the suitcase twice. When I made it to the front door, I realized something unbelievable. The layout of the hallway had changed overnight. My throat went tight and I tasted fear on my tongue, bitter metallic. The exit looked further away, as though the corridor had stretched. Each step I took felt more difficult than the last, like walking against a force that wanted to keep me inside. By the time I reached the door, I was sweating, chest-heaving, tears welling in my eyes from sheer dread. I grabbed the doorknob, turning it with trembling fingers. It opened, but behind it was not the outside porch. Instead, I was met with another hallway, dark and endless, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. My heart lurched and a strangled sound escaped my throat. For a moment, I stood on quaking legs, pulses of panic flooding my body. My mind spun with the impossibility of it. I closed the door with a shaky hand, took a few steps back, and forced myself to breathe, eyes stinging with sweat. I tried to steady my thoughts. I told myself the house was twisting, reacting to my fear, feeding on it. If I didn't calm down, there might be no escape. I tried the door again, and this time I was met with a rush of cold air from outside. Relief slammed into me, and I nearly collapsed. Clutching my suitcase, I stumbled onto the porch. My heart still pounded, but I could breathe again. The sunlight felt unreal after days spent in that suffocating twilight. My vision blurred for a second, and I half expected the yard to shift into some foreign landscape. But nothing changed. The wind and the pines seemed to exhale a long, heavy sigh. I walked to my car, every nerve in my body still wound tight, expecting at any moment for the front door to swing open behind me and reveal another twisted corridor. Yet the house remained still, watching silent. When I finally turned the key in the ignition, I felt my shoulders sag with relief. The weight of the place still clung to me, but I was determined to leave it behind. As I drove away, I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. The house stood at the end of the gravel driveway, looking strangely smaller, more ordinary in the daylight, but I swore I could see movement behind one of the windows, a shift of shadow that sent another jolt of adrenaline coursing through me. Even now, back in my own apartment and far from those oppressive walls, I feel that house hovering in my thoughts. My nights are haunted by flickers of corridors and half-heard voices. I dream of the locked armor, the hidden basement, the impossible doors. Some part of me believes I was never meant to finish that manuscript there, that the house was drawing on my words, weaving them into its reality. I haven't touched the novel since I left, too frightened of what might escape its pages if I continue. My hands still shake at the memory of those whispered conversations and creeping shadows. I wonder if the house let me leave, or if it merely released me once it had taken what it needed. There's a lingering presence in my head, a faint echo that reminds me some doors once opened, even on the page, can never truly be closed. Story 7, I still remember the exact moment I felt something inside my chest tighten, as though an invisible hand had reached in and squeezed my heart. A single bead of sweat traced a slow freezing line down my temple, and I felt the temperature drop around me, even though the thermostat showed the same reading it always did. My senses screamed that something was wrong, but my mind refused to accept it. I was in my office, not some abandoned house or nighttime alley. This was my workplace, a place of spreadsheets, paperwork, and printers that forever jammed at the worst possible times. It shouldn't have felt dangerous, but every cell in my body insisted otherwise. That was the precise instant I realized my life would never be the same. When I started my day, I had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. I'm an accountant. My work is methodical, based on logic and precision. I arrived at the firm early as usual with a coffee in hand and a slight ache in my lower back. From an uncomfortable night's sleep, I recall grumbling about a looming tax deadline. The fluorescent lights in the office corridor flickered ominously, but that was normal. Maintenance was forever behind on those repairs. My colleagues gave polite nods as I passed, each of us weighed down by our own daily tasks. Somewhere inside me, an uneasiness was brewing, though I tried to dismiss it as work-related stress. If only it had been that simple. Toward mid-morning, I needed to grab some files from the storage room. It's a cramped space piled high with old boxes, half lit by a single overhead bulb that always seemed too weak. That day, the air in the storage room felt unnaturally still, as if someone had snuffed out all movement. I heard a strange low humming, like electricity coursing through the walls. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my heart pound so hard that I worried others might hear it. Then I saw them. 3 humanoid figures standing unnervingly still in the far corner, their silhouettes half lost in the dim light. At first I thought they were employees, maybe from another department, until I noticed their 2 long arms and the reflective gleam in their eyes. My lungs clenched as if starved for air. They did not speak in any clear way. I can't recall hearing words come out of their mouths at all. Instead, a soft pulsing sensation filled my mind, as if they were urging me to step forward. I inched backward, fumbling for the door handle, but my hands were slick with cold sweat. I felt a jolt surge through me, like static electricity multiplied 1,000 times, when one of the beings lifted a hand that bent in a way no human limb should. I staggered, my stomach twisting with an acrid taste of fear. Before I could scream, the storage room erupted in a burst of radiant light. A portal, circular and pulsing with shifting colors, opened behind them. It looked almost liquid, rippling with a silent intensity. I tried to resist, but my body refused to obey my frantic commands to run. My breath was ragged, and I could feel hot tears pooling at the corners of my eyes. The creatures advanced, and without a sound forced me toward that portal. My heels scraped against the cement floor, leaving streaks of rubber behind, but it was no use. Their touch was ice cold, yet somehow it burned my skin through my clothing. Then my vision was engulfed by the brilliant white, and I felt myself plunge into a suffocating void. When I came to, I hoped I was still in my office. I recognized the rows of cubicles, the same off-white walls, the same flickering fluorescent lights overhead. My head throbbed, and my mouth was so dry it hurt to swallow. The first inkling that something was wrong came when I looked out the window. The sky wasn't quite the right shade of blue. It had a faint purple tint, as though someone had applied a strange filter to the world. My heart hammered again. I heard the staccato beat of my pulse echo in my eardrums. Trying to calm myself, I stepped over to the nearest clock on the wall. It ticked backward. At first, I thought it might be broken, but then I looked around and realized every clock displayed reverse time. The second hands moved in reverse, the minute hands creeping backward in unison. My throat constricted. I glanced at my wristwatch. It followed the same reversed path. Mocking any sense of normalcy I had left. Strange details kept surfacing, each more unsettling than the last. The desk chairs were a slightly different design. The brand logo on the stack of printer papers spelled incorrectly. The angle of the overhead lights a few degrees off from what it should have been. My colleagues, or what seemed to be them, sat at their computers with silent focus. 1 or 2 lifted their heads at my approach, but offered no greeting. Instead of the usual morning chatter about the weather or weekend plans, I was met with vague, hollow expressions. They did not seem hostile at first, just disturbingly indifferent, as though they recognized me but didn't bother to acknowledge my presence. It felt like standing among mannequins that pretended to be coworkers. I tried to question them indirectly, asking if they noticed anything unusual. I received only curt nods or blank stars in return, as if they had no idea what I was talking about. My breath grew rapid again and a rolling anxiety coursed through me. My shoulders tensed painfully and my palms were slick with a mixture of sweat and dread. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears, accompanied by the faint hum of the overhead lights. Somehow that hum sounded sharper, like nails scraping on metal. It was around lunchtime, or at least what should have been lunchtime, according to my watch counting backward when I noticed a coworker approach me with a forced smile. She did not speak outright, but nodded in a way that suggested she wanted me to follow her. My pulse skyrocketed as she led me down a hallway that looked identical to the real one, except the paint was a shade too bright. The floor squeaked under our shoes, reverberating far more loudly than they should. My stomach flipped in anxiety, yet I followed, propelled by a desperate need to understand what was happening. She indicated that I should enter one of the private meeting rooms. My mind reeled with images of those humanoid figures from the storage room. My instincts told me to run, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the walls were painted in swirling patterns that seemed to shift if I stared at them too long. The overhead light flickered between dull yellow and pale green in an erratic pattern. She gestured to a seat and left. Closing the door behind her without a word, I sat there swallowing hard and trying to steady my trembling hands on the polished surface of the meeting table. Though no one explicitly said anything, I felt an oppressive force, as if I were being observed by unseen eyes. My neck tingled with a primal sense of danger. The walls seemed to breathe in and out, and I realized I was hyperventilating. My heart slammed inside my chest, and I could almost taste copper in my mouth. I had the distinct impression that something was pushing into my mind, rummaging through my memories like old files. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, and a swirl of confusion tried to rewrite my thoughts, as if I were forgetting key details about my life outside this bizarre place. Blinking hard, I forced myself up from the chair and stumbled out of the room. The hallway looked different, longer, darker, with no windows in sight. I roamed the corridors, following the faint hum that seemed to tug at me, leading me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. My legs trembled with each step. The corners of the hallway seemed to bend inward, warping in my peripheral vision. Occasionally, I glimpsed movements from the corners of my eyes, shadows that darted away the moment I turned my head. Sweat rolled down my spine, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. More and more, I struggled to recall specifics about my life back in the real world. I knew I was an accountant, that I had a place I called home. But the memories of my apartment or the route I took to work started to blur. Panic clawed at my throat. My reflection in a glass office partition looked off. My features were correct, but my eyes seemed distant. I blinked rapidly, hoping it was a trick of the odd lighting. Yet as I forced my mind to piece together details, my old boss's face, the name of my college, what street I lived on, the answers slipped through my grasp like water through my fingers. In a haze of growing terror, I found a quiet spot in a supply alcove and sank to the floor. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my heart thundered so loudly I thought it might burst. I tried to recall each letter of my own name, to repeat it internally like a mantra. Each attempt felt like an uphill battle, as though something were smudging my identity from within. Tremors racked my hands. My clothes clung to my skin, damp with cold sweat. Every sense told me that if I lost grip on who I was, this place would become my prison forever. An older colleague, someone I recognized from the real world, passed by, and I noticed the subtle way his posture had changed. He walked stiffly, eyes unfocused, as though a part of him had already been swallowed by this dimension. I tried to catch his attention to see if any shred of recognition remained in him. He only cocked his head, offering a faint nod as if acknowledging me out of politeness, then continued on his path. The friction of his shoes against the floor left a disturbing echo that lingered longer than it should have, bouncing off the silent walls. Desperate to break free from the suffocating atmosphere, I rushed to the stairwell, hoping to find an exit. The door was unmarked, which was already strange, but I pushed through it. My body trembled from adrenaline and my lungs felt like they were on fire from holding in so many panicked breaths. Inside the stairwell, the lights buzzed aggressively and the walls hummed in tune. I descended step after step, yet the numbers on the signs for each floor seemed to go in reverse, order reinforcing the impossible logic of this place. Eventually, I reached a landing with an exit sign, gripping the cold metal handle. I yanked the door open, heart pounding in anticipation of escape. Instead of the outside world, I found another corridor that resembled the interior of my firm. The floors were the same, the lights the same, but with each step, the hallway stretched further into a vanishing point. I fought the urge to scream, every instinct telling me I was on the brink of insanity. A faint, tiny echo seemed to resonate in my head as though the dimension itself was laughing at my attempts. Still determined, I decided to search for any anomaly that might serve as a doorway back. My memory was patchy, but I recalled how I had entered a portal of white light in the storage room. Perhaps another portal existed. My heart thudded unevenly and my breath rattled, but I forced myself to keep moving. Scanning every room, the once familiar place felt like a labyrinth. Eventually, I came upon a storage space that gave me an eerie sense of déjà vu. My breath caught when I heard that same electrical hum I'd encountered before. Fear radiated through my body. My knees felt weak, my palms soaked. Yet a glimmer of hope told me I might find a way home. Summoning what was left of my courage, I opened the door. Inside, the air was thick and charged, much like the moment before a thunderstorm. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I could feel sweat dripping down my temples. In the far corner, a distortion in the air glowed with that familiar pulsing light. The memory of being dragged in by those humanoid figures hit me like a punch in the gut, and I almost doubled over from the wave of panic. My vision blurred momentarily, and I tasted bile in the back of my throat. Steadying myself against a filing cabinet, I realized that stepping through might be the only chance I had to escape. I dared not think too long about what might happen if I stayed. My sense of self was already slipping. I couldn't lose any more memories. Still, I hesitated. The air itself pulsed, as if encouraging me to cross or maybe taunting me. I felt that relentless pressure in my mind again, prodding, trying to erase the last fragments of who I was. My heart pounded so violently that every beat reverberated in my ears. I forced a slow intake of breath, ignoring the dryness in my mouth and the trembling in my arms. The portal crackled its edges, flickering with a dull luminescence that seemed to beckon, summoning every ounce of willpower. I took a running leap toward it. My body tensed, muscles coiled like springs. The sensation of crossing was like plunging into ice water while simultaneously being wrapped in searing heat. My nerves screamed in confusion. For a split second, my mind went completely blank. No thoughts, no memories, just raw, blinding sensation. Then I felt the floor collapse beneath my feet and time stretched in a nauseating spiral. When I opened my eyes, I found myself sprawled on a cold, hard surface that looked like the floor of the real office's storage room. My entire body was soaked in sweat. My heart thundered and my stomach churned violently. The static hiss that had plagued me vanished abruptly, leaving my ears ringing in the sudden silence. Everything felt sharper, more real. The color of the walls, the glow of the lights, even the dull odor of stale cardboard. It all seemed comfortingly ordinary. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the wobble in my knees. Gasping for air, I realized I could recall my name again. I whispered it under my breath just to confirm it was still mine. Relief flooded through me, but it was mingled with a sense of profound unease. In my peripheral vision, I caught sight of my reflection in a glass panel. My eyes looked normal, but the memory of them appearing hollow in that other world haunted me. My clothes felt damp and clingy, and I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, feeling the rapid beat of my pulse in my fingertips. No one came to investigate my ordeal, though part of me expected a crowd of concerned coworkers. The storage room door was closed, and I cautiously pushed it open, stepping out into the hallway. Everything seemed normal once again. The chatter of office life hummed gently in the background. The clocks on the wall showed the correct time, moving forward the way they should. My watch was similarly functional, its second hand ticking in comforting precision, yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Throughout the day, I swore I felt eyes on me whenever I turned a corner. My coworkers gave me polite smiles, occasionally asking if I was feeling okay because apparently I looked pale. Their concern seemed genuine, but I couldn't be sure. A kernel of paranoia had taken root. Had I truly returned to my original world, or was this just another layer of a twisted dimension meant to lull me into complacency? By the time I left the office, I was drenched in anxiety. Every step felt unreal, like walking through a dream. The crisp outdoor air helped a bit, but I still couldn't fully relax. The sound of traffic, the smells of the city. Each sensation nearly overwhelmed me as though I was experiencing it all for the first time. A part of me feared that any moment the sky would shift to that unnatural purple hue, or that the sidewalks would stretch endlessly forward, trapping me in a new labyrinth. Even after reaching home, I spent hours pacing, checking the corners of each room, half convinced I'd see one of those humanoid figures lurking in the shadows. Now, as I write these words, my hands are trembling. The memories of that parallel place linger at the edges of my thoughts, threatening to rob me of peace. Nightmares plague my sleep, replaying in vivid detail how the clocks moved backward and how my identity slipped away. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror and swear the eyes looking back aren't entirely mine. In those moments, my heart races and I'm seized by a suffocating terror that I never truly escaped, that the portal somehow branded me with its mark. I'm left in a state of perpetual unease, uncertain if the threat has passed or if it's still out there waiting to pull me back into that mirrored office. There is no closure, just the lingering knowledge that something wants to rewrite me in its image. Whether I'm safe or merely in a temporary reprieve, I do not know. But I do know one thing: I'll never be the same person I was before. Something about that dimension clings to me like a shadow that refuses to let go. And I can sense that my struggle to remain myself has only just begun. Norried. 8. The silence in my new apartment complex was unsettling from the very first night. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, thick in the air, pressing in on my eardrums until I swore I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the walls. Even the elevator, an old mechanical beast that groaned and wheezed, came to rest on my floor with an abrupt thud as if trying to startle me. The corridors were narrow, the lighting dim, and every door was painted in a uniform shade of pale gray that made the entire building seem drained of vitality. Despite the unnerving stillness, I had hoped this place would be a refuge, a fresh start after my divorce. But the sense that something was watching me from behind every mirror made my skin crawl in a way I could not rationalize. I tried to shrug off that initial discomfort as a reaction to the trauma of the past few months. My divorce had not been amicable, and I felt untethered, like a part of me had been cut away. So when I unlocked the front door of my seventh floor apartment, I told myself the tightness in my chest was just residual anxiety. I had no idea how quickly that feeling of unease would escalate. That very evening, as I unpacked, I realized something odd about the building's mirrors. Every apartment door in the hallway had a small mirror affixed near the peephole. Mine was no exception. At first glance, it seemed like a quirky design choice, perhaps to check one's reflection before answering the door. But the angle of these mirrors felt off, as if they were meant for something else entirely. Late that first night, I was arranging books on my shelf when I noticed my reflection in a nearby glass frame was not in sync with my movements. The difference was subtle. I was placing a hard cover on the top shelf, but for the briefest second, my reflection appeared to hold the book at waist level. I blinked and the image realigned. I told myself I was exhausted, maybe even hallucinating from stress. My heart hammered against my ribs nonetheless, and cold sweat beatated at my temples. That should have been my cue to call someone, my ex, a friend, or even a doctor, but I didn't want to burden anyone. I chose to ignore it, believing it was just an overactive imagination. Over the course of the next few days, the strangest compounded. Sometimes I caught glimpses of my own face in the building's mirrors, like the one in the lobby near the mailboxes. Doing things I wasn't doing, turning around to look over my shoulder when I stood perfectly still, or even gesturing as if waving at someone who wasn't there. My pulse would quicken, my breathing turned shallow, and a nausea would knot up my stomach. Yet every time I tried to look directly, the reflection behaved. Normally, I felt like a man slowly unraveling, and the more I tried to dismiss these visions, the more persistent they became. The real turning point came when I checked my phone. One afternoon, I had set up my camera to record a short video in my living room while I tested a new tripod stand I'd bought online. I wanted to see if it was stable enough for filming. The recording was only meant to last about a minute. When I played it back, I saw something that made the blood pound in my ears. In the background, I watched myself walk across the living room, pick up the remote from the coffee table, and switch on the TV. But in reality, I knew I never moved from my spot by the tripod. The footage showed me crossing the room while my actual self stood perfectly still behind the phone, adjusting the tripod legs. My heart raced so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest, and I could feel the sweat gathering under my arms. Goosebumps prickled on my forearms as the video continued. My apparent double turned to the camera and smirked just a split second before the recording ended. Terrified, I tried to share this footage with the building manager, but he dismissed my concerns with polite indifference. He asked if perhaps I was messing with special video effects or if I might be mixing up old recordings. His tone was calm, though he seemed slightly uneasy, as if I had joined a club of eccentric residents. He did mention indirectly that some neighbors had also complained about strange occurrences near reflective surfaces. I felt a mix of relief and dread upon hearing that I wasn't the only one noticing bizarre reflections. Still, he insisted there was nothing to worry about, that lukewarm reassurance did nothing to quell my anxiety. With every passing day, the sense of being watched grew stronger. I remember lying in bed one night, drenched in sweat despite the apartment's cool temperature. Certain I could hear the faint sound of someone breathing just behind my mirror in the bathroom. My heart thudded so loudly I could hear my pulse in my ears. When I summoned the courage to get up and check flicking on the harsh fluorescent light above the sink, all I saw was my own pale, terrified face. But something felt wrong about the reflection, like my eyes didn't match my fear. They seemed curious, almost amused. I quickly splashed cold water on my face, my hands shaking so violently that I almost dropped the soap. I began to suspect that the mirrors themselves were responsible for these strange occurrences, so I covered every reflective surface I could find. I draped towels over the bathroom mirror and taped sheets of newspaper across the bedroom mirror. My phone, my laptop screen, even the black screen of my television started to make me uneasy, so I tried to keep them all turned away or covered when not in use. Still, reflections are impossible to avoid entirely. Windows by night become dark mirrors, and puddles in the street can offer distorted glimpses. Every time I spotted my reflection unexpectedly, I felt a jolt of fear and my skin prickled with electricity. Sometimes my reflection would seem to linger a fraction of a second too long before mirroring my actions, and it was enough to make me break out in a clammy sweat. Then I discovered something else. During a conversation with one of my neighbors, an older man who lived on the floor below, he admitted he had noticed unusual reflections too. Though he refused to give details, he mentioned in a hushed tone that rumors circulated about the building's mirrors capturing fragments of the residents' souls. Some claimed these fragments eventually grew into independent entities. The neighbor spoke mostly in a low, hurried mumble as though worried someone might overhear. He warned that once a mirror caught even a tiny piece of you, it would replicate it, shaping a separate consciousness that existed in parallel. He also hinted that management knew far more than they admitted, but no one would say anything outright. My mouth went dry and a tremor racked my body as I realized how closely his warnings aligned with my own experiences. Shortly after that unsettling conversation, my phone began acting up. Random videos appeared in my gallery, clips of me going about my day, but from angles I couldn't possibly have filmed myself. In one video, I was seen standing at the hallway mirror, running my hand over the glass as though searching for a hidden seam. My chest seized with panic because I had absolutely no memory of doing that. Worse still, in the reflection of the glass, I could discern at least two versions of me blinking out of sync. My stomach churned and my throat felt constricted as though I might vomit. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I rushed to delete the video, hoping to erase this surreal evidence of a fractured reality. By the following week, I found myself battling constant paranoia. The building's lighting felt oppressive, with flickering bulbs casting elongated shadows that seemed to twist whenever I looked away. Late at night, I heard unexplained creaks and whispers in the hallway, and I felt certain the mirrors on the doors were observing my every move. My reflection in the small mirror outside my apartment seemed perpetually on the verge of smiling whenever I passed by. The tension in my muscles never let up. My jaw stayed clenched, and I ground my teeth in my sleep. Leaving my mouth sore and my mind exhausted by morning, I felt pinned beneath this weight of unseen eyes. Eventually, I confronted the building manager again. This time, I told him outright that something was wrong with the mirrors. I demanded he explain the rumors, or at least confirm that I wasn't imagining things. He kept his expression neutral, replying in a calm voice that there was nothing officially documented about supernatural occurrences. He suggested that I might be experiencing stress from my personal life. Though his words were carefully chosen, I detected a flicker of alarm in his eyes. It was as if he knew exactly what was happening but had no intention of interfering. My pulse drummed in my ears as I walked away. My legs felt shaky, as though they could barely support me. In search of answers, I spent hours pacing the corridors, trying to find any sign of a hidden mechanism or trick in the mirrors. In the basement, I discovered a locked storage room whose door boasted a larger than average mirror. That mirrored surface shimmered faintly in the dim overhead light, and I had the eerie impression it was pulsing, almost breathing. My instincts screamed at me to back away. Yet, driven by desperation, I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling a cold shock ripple through me. For a heartbeat, I swore. I felt another hand pressing back. My heart thundered so loudly I thought I might black out, and I yanked my hand away, stumbling backward with a cry that caught in my throat. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled to get out of the basement, certain I wasn't alone down there. That night's sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined dozens of mirrored figures creeping out from behind their reflective cages, each one a twisted version of myself. My entire body was slick with sweat, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. In the early morning hours, I woke abruptly from a half-sleep to find my phone lying next to me recording. The screen displayed my face, but it was unrecognizable, pale drawn and wearing an expression of predatory interest. I had never seen before. I slammed the device onto the floor in a panic. My stomach turned and I struggled to keep from retching. With trembling hands, I turned off the recording and deleted it, but the terror of that image burned itself into my mind. I realized I needed to do something drastic. I couldn't live like that anymore. So I decided to confront these reflections directly. Near midnight, I stepped into the hallway, armed with a flashlight and a blanket to cover the mirror on my door. The corridor was silent, save for the faint buzz of faulty electrical wiring. I approached my apartment door's mirror, my heart pounding so hard my vision almost blurred. Then in the dim glow of the flashlight, I saw it, my reflection not following my movements. My arms were tense at my sides, but the reflection had one hand raised as if beckoning me closer. I remember the jolt of raw, primal terror that shot through my body at that moment. My breath caught in my throat, and a wave of dizziness swept over me. Yet I forced myself to approach the glass hand, trembling uncontrollably as I reached out to drape the blanket over it. Just before the cloth covered the mirror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection smiling. It was a grin devoid of warmth or humanity, and it made my blood run cold. Throughout the next hour, I methodically covered every mirror I could find in the common areas. If anyone had seen me, they might have called security, but I was past the point of caring. My entire body quivered, and my lungs felt like they weren't absorbing oxygen properly. Each step was driven by sheer desperation, a survival instinct that overshadowed any embarrassment. By the time I was finished, sweat was pouring down my back and my breathing was ragged from adrenaline. The building's corridors, robbed of their reflective surfaces, seemed strangely claustrophobic, but at least I didn't have to see any more of those unnatural movements following me. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. The handwriting was neat, likely from the building manager. It stated that covering the mirrors was not allowed, and that I could face fines or eviction if I continued. The content was brief and formal, but it conveyed a clear message. I was threatening the status quo, and they wanted me to stop. My jaw clenched in frustration. My ex-wife's criticisms of my impulsiveness echoed in my mind. Still, I refused to be bullied into exposing myself to those horrifying reflections again. Driven by equal parts fear and fury, I decided to pack my belongings and leave. Maybe this was a form of escape, but I valued my sanity more than any sense of pride about staying. With shaking hands, I stuffed clothes into boxes and bags, ignoring the unnatural hush that had fallen over the apartment. Every so often, I'd feel a prickling at the back of my neck, as though something was standing right behind me waiting. My heart would leap into my throat and I'd whirl around only to see empty air. Even so, the apartment felt alive in a deeply unsettling way. The longer I stayed, the more intense that sensation became, as if the walls themselves were breathing in unison with me. When the last box was loaded into my car, I rushed downstairs. Passing by the once covered mirrors, now clear again, I caught sight of my reflection from the corner of my eye. I forced myself not to look too closely. My chest constricted in terror, and I could feel my legs shaking as I hurried out of the building. That final stretch from the lobby to the exit felt like a gauntlet. The glass doors at the entrance were polished to a pristine shine, and as I approached, I saw my reflection clearly. It stared back with a hollow gaze. For a split second, the face in the glass tilted its head at a slightly different angle than I did. My breath caught, and I felt my pulse flutter unevenly. Then, as if some invisible barrier broke our movements, realigned. Desperate to be free, I shoved the door open and stepped into the daylight. Outside, I allowed myself one trembling exhalation of relief. The sun felt unnaturally bright, and the normal sounds of traffic and distant chatter were jarring after the quiet of the building. Yet I couldn't shake the lingering dread. Part of me feared that the fragments captured by those mirrors might follow me, that my reflection could come alive in any surface anywhere. Even as I drove away, I avoided looking in the rearview mirror. My hands were locked in a death grip on the steering wheel, my shoulders stiff with tension. I ended up staying in a motel that night, choosing a room with the smallest possible bathroom mirror. I spent hours trying to gather my thoughts, but all I could focus on was the memory of that smirk on my reflection's face. In my mind, the building's hallway stretched like a labyrinth of hidden watchers, each mirror a doorway to a darkness beyond my understanding. I found myself compulsively checking every reflective surface in the room, waiting for something impossible to appear. Even now, I can't say for certain that I escaped. A gnawing fear clings to me, whispering that what the mirrors captured is still out there, aware of my existence. Anytime I glimpse my face in a window or a passing car's shiny exterior, I brace myself for the slightest abnormality. My heart pounds and I steel myself for the possibility that my reflection might be staring back with a mind of its own. I don't know if I'll ever truly feel safe again. The sense that something was taken from me and that something may still be lurking in those mirrors lingers. It's as if a piece of my soul remains trapped in that building, waiting for me to return, or worse, waiting for an opportunity to break free into my life. I live with that tension daily, a constant cold weight on my chest that I may never be rid of, and that in its own way is far more terrifying than any nightmare I could ever imagine. Story 9. I knew something was deeply wrong. The moment I saw my own front hallway on the screen replayed with unsettling clarity. A faint, distorted echo of my breathing leaked from the speakers, as if the walls themselves were gasping. Shadows rippled across the video feed, exaggerating the angles of the corridor, making it seem longer, almost like it was stretching to accommodate something that did not belong in my home. My heart thudded in my chest, a nervous drum roll heralding the start of an experience that would challenge my understanding of reality. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was a trick of the camera. Yet deep down, a dread I couldn't name began to form. It sat at the pit of my stomach, coiled tight, ready to strike. I first noticed the anomaly a few nights ago. For months, I had been working as a security consultant from home, setting up specialized webcams around my house for an upcoming demonstration. Every angle was covered: living room, kitchen, and the hallway just outside my bedroom door. That narrow corridor seemed so ordinary at first. Wooden floor planks that creaked whenever I stepped on certain spots, a single overhead bulb that buzzed softly, flickering whenever there was a voltage drop. It was never a place of significance or fear. But after that night, everything changed. Thing, Late in the evening, I set up a routine test. I placed a call from my laptop to my phone, letting the hallway camera broadcast to me in real time. I wanted to verify the clarity and frame rate. The feed looked fine, just the bland stretch of my corridor, but something odd happened. After a few seconds, I realized I was hearing a faint shuffle, as though someone was dragging their feet beyond the camera's field of view. I glanced at the hallway in person and saw nothing. Yet on my screen it seemed there was a shape at the edge of the frame, a silhouette so dim I almost convinced myself it was an artifact of poor lighting. I dismissed it that first time. I reasoned that old wiring and cheap cameras often create illusions, reflections, or lens flares, particularly in low light. My shoulders relaxed. I shut down the feed and went to bed, ignoring the chill that prickled the back of my neck as I walked through the corridor. My footsteps sounded louder than normal, each one echoing in a way that set my nerves on edge. But I pushed down the discomfort I needed to sleep. When I woke up the following morning, I reviewed the recordings to see if there were any technical glitches. My breath caught in my throat the moment I saw the figure. At the 2-minute mark, a shape entered the corridor, dark, unsteady, taking small, halting steps toward the camera. At first, I thought it was a stranger. The figure wore clothes identical to what I'd worn that night: a simple gray t-shirt, black sweatpants, and mismatched socks. When it turned and faced the camera, I froze. Its posture, the tilt of its head, it all looked like mine, almost a perfect match. Yet there was a sickening half-second delay to its motions, as though it mimicked something that had already happened. I blinked hard, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I had walked through that corridor and simply forgotten. But no matter how I tried to twist the facts, none of it explained the half-second lag or the odd shimmer around its edges like static on an old TV. That day, a nagging sense of dread clung to me. Whenever I stepped into the hallway, my heart sped up. My palms grew clammy, and I found myself walking faster, struggling to breathe. The overhead light flickered again, more insistently this time, as though it too felt my anxiety. I tried to distract myself with work, focusing on analyzing security footage from external clients, but my eyes kept straying to that final screenshot from last night's recording. The figure that looked exactly like me, wearing the same clothes, repeating my gestures. The following night, I forced myself to recreate the situation. I set up the camera feed, turned off most lights, and left only the hallway bulb on. Around midnight, I heard that same shuffle. I sat at my desk watching the live feed. It was my hallway, empty, quiet. The door at the far end faintly illuminated. I felt my skin prickle. I strained to hear every minor sound: the buzzing of electronics, the hum of my fridge, my own ragged breathing. As the minutes stretched, a subtle movement finally caught my eye. At the far edge of the frame, the darkness warped. The overhead bulb flickered just once, and when it did, the shape was suddenly there. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was a full outline of a person. My outline, I felt my pulse gallop in my chest like a wild animal. My breath caught in short gasps, and sweat beaded on my forehead, running in cold rivulets down my temples. My hands shook so violently that the laptop nearly slipped off my desk. As I stared, I realized that the figure moved in perfect sync with my memories of how I'd walked the corridor the night before, down to the quick glance at my phone, the scratch at my elbow. Everything was an echo. and yet I knew I was sitting in my chair. Safe, wasn't I? The feed was live, but the figure felt like a leftover image of me from some other point in time. I wanted to call a friend, maybe share the experience, but the thought of explaining it made me feel insane. Instead, I recorded everything. I sat motionless, a cold knot in my stomach, letting the camera run. Eventually, the figure moved out of sight and the feed returned to normal. My hallway was empty again and the rest of the house lay silent, but my mind wouldn't let it go. The next day, I reviewed the footage a dozen times. Every review made my throat tighten. The figure was definitely me. Same haircut, same stance, even a slight limp I sometimes get after a bad workout, but it was never entirely synchronized. It was as if the figure was reliving something I'd done but half a second behind, always threatening to catch up. I felt a crawling panic at the idea that I might be leaving echoes in my own home, or worse, that something wearing my face was trying to find a way into my present. In the following days, the phenomenon grew more intense. Each new night, I tested the camera. Each time, the figure appeared more solid than before, always dressed exactly like I'd been that evening, repeating. My gestures with that maddening delay. My anxiety skyrocketed. I jumped at every small sound, the squeak of the floorboards, the distant hiss of pipes, the groan of the house settling. My mouth went dry anytime I stepped into the hallway, and I'd find myself pausing, listening, convinced that I was hearing footsteps that weren't mine. The air seemed heavy, almost charged, as though an electrical storm was about to break out inside my own home. At one point, I tried to explain my predicament to a colleague over the phone. I kept it vague, describing only a camera glitch showing illusions of myself. The colleague responded with cautious curiosity, asking if I'd messed with any advanced software or if I'd installed motion tracking technology. I muttered that I hadn't done anything out of the ordinary, but I still felt uneasy even hinting at the truth. Eventually, the conversation shifted to mundane topics, but I was left with a pounding headache and a sense that I was alone in this. No one could truly understand or help because no rational explanation fit the evidence. Sleep became nearly impossible. My dreams were haunted by flickering images of the corridor, the overhead bulb swinging back and forth, casting broken shards of light on the walls. Sometimes I dreamed I stood face to face with the double our eyes locked. In those dreams, I could see every detail of its face, my face. Yet there was a distortion around the eyes, a slight blur as if my reflection was not entirely stable. I would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. My sheets felt cold, clammy. I'd lie there, adrenaline coursing through me, convinced I could hear someone breathing just on the other side of my bedroom door. One night I worked up the courage to physically walk into the hallway while watching the feed from my phone. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped it. The corridor looked the same as ever, silent and still, but my breath echoed strangely and the overhead light seemed dimmer as though fighting to stay lit. On the feed, I saw my silhouette standing near the camera phone raised, matching my exact movements in real time except for that split-second lag. A wave of nausea washed over me. The air felt thick in my lungs. My entire body trembled. I took one step forward. The figure in the feed did the same, but the timing was just a fraction of a beat behind. It was so subtle yet so unnatural. My heart hammered and I caught a whiff of something metallic in the air like heated wires or an exposed circuit. It made me dizzy. In my mounting paranoia, I started to suspect the walls were breathing with me. My rational mind told me it was just the settling of the house or the thrum of the HVAC system. But every time I walked that corridor, I felt an oppressive presence pressing down on my shoulders. My vision would blur at the edges and I'd fight back a powerful urge to flee. I tried to remind myself that reality was stable, that time was linear, that I couldn't be seeing my own ghost, especially not a ghost of me from last night. Yet the camera told a different story and every recording confirmed the presence of that twisted echo. The turning point came on a stormy evening. Thunder rattled the windows and the power flickered. I had set up the camera feed once again, though by this point I almost dreaded the process. My skin already had a thin sheen of sweat, and I struggled to keep calm as I clicked through to the live view. The hallway appeared illuminated fitfully by the overhead bulb. Rain battered the roof and the flickering light cast dancing shadows along the walls. I leaned in, breath quivering. Seconds passed, then a minute, then another. The corridor remained empty. Relief seeped into my body, but it was quickly crushed by a new wave of dread, because for the first time I heard something other than shuffling. It was my own voice, faint as if heard through a wall, coming from the speakers. I couldn't make out distinct words, but it was undeniably my pitch, my speech pattern, talking, whispering, maybe even humming. My heart thundered so hard I thought my chest might burst. I tasted copper in the back of my throat and my legs wobbled under me. I forced myself to concentrate, to listen carefully. The voice seemed to mutter something, then it dissolved into static. The overhead light flickered once, and when it came back on, the figure stood directly in front of the camera. Its shoulders rose and fell in shallow, trembling breaths. I let out a cry, though I tried to swallow it, my voice breaking as goosebumps spread across my arms. The figure was wearing my favorite hoodie, the one I had on. Right at that very moment, lightning flashed outside the window, momentarily brightening everything. In that instant, I saw the figure's face clearly. It was mine, except the eyes were not quite aligned, as if each belonged to a slightly different version of me. And the expression was twisted with an unspoken urgency, as though it wanted to break free from its half-second delay and step fully into my present. Moment, a wave of disorientation slammed into me. I couldn't move. My lungs burned and black spots danced before my eyes. I heard the thunder roll again, and then the lights in the hallway died, plunging the feed into darkness. Adrenaline surged, and I burst out of my chair, nearly knocking it over. My phone fell from my hand. I sprinted for the corridor, though a terrified part of me screamed to stay away. I had to see if the figure was really there, if it had finally broken through. The floorboards felt cold and wet under my bare feet. Had the storm leaked inside? Somehow each step sent a tremor through my body. My breath was ragged, heart pounding like a hammer against my ribs. When I reached the hallway, it was empty. The overhead bulb sputtered weakly, barely illuminating the walls. I was alone, or so it seemed. My ears rang with the echo of thunder, and I could smell ozone in the air, that charged scent of electricity. My entire body shook, my gut twisting in knots. As I stood there, a sudden wave of dizziness hit me. For a heartbeat, the hallway seemed longer, the walls pulling away from me. A soft hiss vibrated behind my ears, and my vision blurred. I blinked furiously to clear my head. Then I noticed a wet footprint on the wooden floor right in front of me, matching the size of my own foot. My chest seized. My eyes followed a trail of identical footprints leading toward my bedroom door. They were spaced exactly how I would walk. I felt a suffocating pressure in my chest, and I realized I was hyperventilating, swallowing lungfuls of air too fast. My throat felt like sandpaper. I listened closely, my ears straining, half expecting to hear my own voice or that odd shuffle of feet. The hush that followed was somehow worse than any noise could have been. Gathering all the courage I had left, I stepped toward the footprints, heart-racing, sweat trickling down my back. I remembered an old friend once suggesting I confront what scares me head-on. So I did. I flung open the bedroom door. Inside, the only illumination came from the intermittent lightning outside the window. My bed was empty. My desk cluttered, the curtains flapping in a sudden gust of wind. No figure, no double, but the feeling of another presence lingered, pressing on my mind. For several minutes I stood there panting, sweat dripping from my forehead. My eyes roamed every corner, expecting the figure to leap from a shadow. But nothing happened. Eventually the storm died down, and the only sound was my ragged breath and the distant drip of rainwater into the gutters. I realized the footprints had vanished. No sign of moisture on the floor. I couldn't explain it. My sense of time felt scrambled, like I'd stepped out of one moment and stumbled into another. That night I left every light in the house on, sitting in my living room until the sun rose. My thoughts were a jumble of fear, confusion, and an almost frantic determination. I didn't know if I was caught in some twisted loop, if my house was playing host to a version of me that existed in another timeline, or if I was simply unraveling from lack of sleep. But I decided I wouldn't let it destroy my sanity. I resolved to face this phenomenon directly, to challenge it. In the one place it always showed itself, the hallway camera feed. The next evening, I waited until midnight. My nerves were shattered, but I'd prepared myself with coffee and repeated assurances that I would not run. I set the camera to record and turned off all other devices, plunging the house into silence. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. The corridor feed showed the same drab hallway, the door at the end, the flickering light overhead. Seconds ticked by, my heartbeat thundered in my ears. Then, like clockwork, I saw the silhouette step into view. It mimicked exactly what I had done that day, wearing the same clothes, the same stutter in its movements. Only this time I walked out into the hallway in real time. Phone in hand, I stood in front of the camera, raising my phone so the lens could see me. I stared at the screen. There I was, a live version of myself, and there it was. The double half a second behind, my heartbeat roared and sweat dripped into my eyes, but I steadied myself. I made a deliberate move. I lifted my right hand and tapped my chest. The figure did the same, but just after me, I spoke quietly. Addressing it, I asked who it was. My voice caught in my throat, and I realized I was trembling so hard I could hardly keep the phone steady. The figure's mouth moved as well, forming the same words an instant later. It felt like looking into a mirror with a built-in delay, except everything about it was real. In that moment, the overhead bulb flickered again, stronger this time. The figure lurched, glitching for a split second. Then it snapped its head up, looking directly at me through the camera. My blood ran cold and my grip nearly failed. I understood in a visceral wave of terror that it wasn't just copying me. It was trying to catch up, to collapse the gap between us. The next flicker of the light seemed to push it forward, and its face pressed closer to the lens, almost as if it might push through the screen itself. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, until I hit the opposite wall. My breath was ragged, fear surging through every muscle. I couldn't stand it anymore. I slammed the corridor door shut, as if that alone could seal the thing away in its fractionally delayed world. My ears rang with the echo of my own panicked gasps. For several seconds, I just stood there, pressing my back against the door. The house fell silent. Eventually, I gathered the courage to check the footage. When I reviewed the recording, the corridor was empty. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of me facing off with anything. It was as if the camera had never caught the encounter at all. My mind reeled, unable to reconcile what I'd just witnessed. I realized I might never find a neat explanation for what had happened or why. But one thing was certain: I had confronted that echo, that reflection, or whatever it was, and in the final instant it had tried to merge with me. For now, I've removed every camera from the hallway. I keep the door closed at all times. I'd like to believe I stopped it, that the half-second gap will remain forever unbridged. Yet I can't escape the prickle of unease whenever I pass by that corridor. I swear I can feel eyes on me, tracing my every move with that familiar half-beat delay. Each flicker of light sets my pulse racing again. I refuse to reinstall the camera, even though a part of me is desperate to know if the figure is still there, prowling the edges of reality, waiting for another chance to step fully into this world. In moments of uneasy reflection, I catch myself studying my own behavior, my own gestures, wondering if I'm the original or if I'm already the copy. Late at night, I sometimes think I see someone standing outside the bedroom door, just at the threshold, wearing the clothes I had on the day before. Each time I force myself to look away, refusing to acknowledge the possibility of a presence, because deep down I know that the more attention I give it, the stronger it becomes. And even though no one has been harmed, a persistent dread gnaws at my sanity, leaving me uncertain whether I've truly escaped or simply delayed the inevitable merging of my two selves, waiting to happen in one final flash of flickering light. Story 10, I felt it in the pit of my stomach. The moment the house lights flickered for the third time that night, a creeping tension like a low electric charge rippling across my skin. It was nothing more than a quick pulse at first, just a harsh reminder of the storm raging outside. But beneath the crackling of thunder and the buzz of my overhead fixture, I sensed something else. Something intangible shifting in the hallway shadows. I remember holding my breath and listening, straining to catch any footstep, any soft shuffle across the worn floorboards. My pulse throbbed in my temples, cold sweat gathering along my brow. Even though the place was supposedly empty, I couldn't shake the impression that I was no longer alone. Little did I realize how right I was or how deep that unsettling feeling would run before the night ended. I should clarify my house is not typically the kind of residence one imagines as haunted. It's a cramped but cozy single-story home on a cul-de-sac with a perpetually leaky faucet in the bathroom and a laundry room that doubles as storage for boxes of old keepsakes. I normally feel comfortable there. I moved in a few years ago, patching up walls and painting them a dull eggshell color. The windows are large, letting in plenty of sunlight. Under normal circumstances, it's quite inviting. That night, however, the windows were just perfect black mirrors reflecting the flicker of the living room lamp back at me. Rain pounded the glass in irregular bursts, reminding me how isolated I was in that moment. Thunder rattled the frames. Each jolt tightened the knot in my stomach. I had just put my phone on the coffee table when I noticed a strange dark shape in the corner of my vision. My heart skittered. At first I thought it might be a trick of the low light, maybe a coat thrown over a chair, but the shape moved. It shifted just enough for me to discern that it wasn't an inanimate object. I froze my lungs, squeezing the breath inside me until my chest burned. My eyes focused on the shape, only to realize there was a person crouching in the half-lit corner behind the couch, partially obscured by shadows. Even after I blinked, he stayed there, an unwanted presence that defied explanation. He didn't speak. Instead, he straightened, stepping closer so that the overhead light revealed his features. Sun-sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, like someone who hadn't slept for weeks. In one hand, he held a small rectangular object wrapped in a faded cloth. I took a shaky step back, unsure whether I should try to run or confront him, but my knees felt locked in place. My breathing turned shallow and the thunder outside seemed to grow louder. Every nerve ending in my body was on high alert. My mind kept screaming at me to do something, anything, but I just stood there pinned by a curious mixture of fear and morbid fascination. The man lifted the cloth and revealed an antique hand mirror, the edges adorned with tarnished silver filigree. My immediate thought was to question why this trespasser had appeared in my living room with such a peculiar item. Then I noticed something else. His reflection did not show in the glass. More disturbingly, neither did mine. Instead, the mirror displayed the same room, but empty. My living room was there in that dusty reflection with the couch and coffee table, yet it looked slightly different. Some of the lights were out and the darkness pressed in more heavily than it did in reality. I felt a chilling spike of dread as I realized I was looking at my house 10 minutes from now. The screen of my phone on the table was dark, as though it had turned itself off, and the overhead lamp was dimmer, almost extinguished. Then I noticed movement in the corner of the mirror's reflection. A blurred silhouette pacing near my desk, rummaging through drawers I recognized as the place where I kept old photographs and letters. The intruder in the reflection seemed frantic, as if searching for something. I couldn't pull my gaze away, even though every instinct warned me that I was witnessing a glimpse of something that had not yet happened but was about to happen. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, roaring louder than the storm outside. Without warning, the intruder who stood before me withdrew the mirror, concealing it under the cloth again. He pointed a bony finger at the desk behind me, a silent command or some twisted warning. My throat felt like sandpaper, and when I tried to swallow, it was as though my entire neck had seized up. My mind whirled in panic, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what I had just seen. I heard my own pulse thud against my eardrums. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he slipped backward into the shadows of the hallway leading to the bedrooms. In the blink of an eye, he was gone, completely swallowed by the darkness, leaving me trembling and soaked in cold sweat. I was left with a decision: investigate or flee. My first impulse was to run out the front door storm or not and never look back, but I couldn't simply abandon my home. The illusions or whatever they were had rooted me to the spot. Trying to steady my breath, I crept toward the hallway. I flipped on the light switch, but the bulbs there only fluttered, providing a faint stuttering glow that made the corridor look elongated and full of flickering shadows. It smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic like old pennies. Every footstep I took felt amplified, squeaking softly on the worn hardwood. I ventured to my bedroom first, sure I would find the stranger lurking in a closet or under the bed. Nothing. The door to the guest room was ajar. A thin line of darkness stretched across the carpet. When I pushed it open, cold air brushed against my face as if a frigid presence hovered just beyond the threshold. My hand shook as I reached for the lamp. In that uncertain glow, all I saw were piles of cardboard boxes, half oped from my recent attempts at organizing old belongings. Although the room was cramped, it was undeniably empty of any person I was alone, at least physically. Yet the hush that clung to the walls felt loaded with threat. My breathing had become irregular, a series of short, urgent gasps that made me feel faint. I returned to the living room, checking behind each piece of furniture, every corner and nook. But the intruder had vanished as though he'd melted away. For a moment, I considered that I might have hallucinated the entire encounter, perhaps triggered by stress in the storm. My heart was still racing, but I felt a hint of relief that I found no trace of him. Then I remembered the mirror. My mind replayed that impossible reflection showing the future of the very room I stood in. I had seen a figure rifling through my desk, a figure that certainly wasn't me. The next minutes passed in an agonizing calm, the kind of quiet that made every slight noise, every creak of the settling house, every brush of a tree branch against the window sound like a threat. A deep sense of unease grew inside me. I kept glancing at my phone on the coffee table, noticing the time on its display. Anxiety gnawed at me. I realized that the moment shown in the mirror was approaching. When I heard a soft scraping sound near my desk, my pulse jumped. I forced myself to creep in that direction, trying to ignore my quivering knees. My breathing turned shallow again, a cold sweat forming on my palms. The room was dark except for the lamp on the end table, which bathed everything in a sickly yellow glow. Even so, I could make out a presence, a wavering shape that stood partially hidden beside my desk. My head pulsed with fear as I realized this was exactly what I had seen in the mirror's reflection. A figure rummaging through my drawers, pulling out old pictures and placing them on the surface as if searching for something specific. My mouth went dry. This was no longer just a vision or a possibility. It was happening. The figure did not immediately register my presence. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as if guided by compulsion. My heart slammed against my ribs and a cold wave of dread spilled down my spine. Without conscious thought, I fumbled for the small desk lamp, switching it on. A thin beam illuminated the intruder, revealing him to be the same stranger I had confronted earlier, the one with the hollow eyes. The mirror was absent from his hands. Now, though, instead he clutched an old envelope between his bony fingers, something I recognized as part of a set of letters from my grandfather. They were simply historical keepsakes, nothing of value to anyone else, but apparently important enough for him to hunt for. He turned to me then, and my whole body tensed. I could see the jagged rise and fall of his shoulders as if he was breathing in shallow, rapid bursts, mirroring my own fearful rhythm. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I stayed rooted in place, blood pounding in my ears. The memory of that mirror's impossible reflection seized my thoughts. Everything was happening the way I'd seen it. Some twisted loop of time had been forced into existence, and I was caught in it, unable to tear myself free. He made a quiet remark, just a few words in a low, rasping tone that suggested he finally acknowledged I was there. It wasn't a plea exactly, nor a threat. It felt more like a statement of sad inevitability. The specifics were impossible to make out, and part of me believes it was better that way. I recall how the hair on my forearm stood on end. how a fresh rivulet of sweat slid down my temple. My thoughts blurred. Would he attack? Would he vanish into thin air? The tension hammered at my senses like a vice, squeezing my chest tighter with each second. Just as I considered lunging for the phone to call for help, he took a step toward me. My vision swam with fear. The overhead light dimmed inexplicably as though energy had been drained from the room. I took 2 steps back, hands clenched. Yet he didn't advance further. Instead, he lifted the envelope he held, turned it over, and seemed to study the ancient ink as if it contained some final answer to a question that had plagued him forever. The sense of intrusion intensified, and in that moment I realized that his presence was more than just physical. It felt like the air itself weighed on my shoulders, stifling my ability to think or move. He let the envelope drop onto the desk, then reached behind himself to produce the mirror again. The reflection inside it was swirling a churning mass of shadows that gradually formed into an image of my own living room. But this time I caught sight of myself in the reflection. Watching him, I saw that my figure in the mirror wore a look of absolute terror, the same expression I felt twisting my features. And the stranger in the mirror, he was flickering, fading in and out as if he existed in an overlapping reality. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would burst. A sudden flicker of lightning lit up the room through the windows, and for one raw, blinding moment I saw the truth clearly. The reflection was not just showing me the future or the present, but multiple layers of possibility all at once. My mind reeled. The roars of thunder vibrated the glass in the window panes, and I clenched my fists, struggling to control the rush of panic. The intruder's lips parted, but instead of hearing words, I felt a soundless shock wave inside my head, like something just beyond the edge of hearing. My eyes flicked to the mirror's surface again, and the shadows inside it expanded like ink in water, blotting out the entire reflection. That was when the lamp on the desk burst with a sharp crack, plunging the room into near total darkness. My adrenaline spiked, cold fear flooding my veins. I dropped to a knee. Reflexively, my balance thrown by the sudden shift in light. Shards of the bulb clattered on the floor. The only illumination left was the sporadic flashes of lightning from outside. Each one briefly etching the stranger's silhouette into my retinas, I willed myself to stand, ignoring the trembling in my legs. In one luminous flash, I saw him kneel near the scattered papers on the floor. In the next flash, he was standing at the threshold leading to the hallway again. The next instant, nothing. He was gone. No footstep, no door creaking, just an empty corridor that yawned like the mouth of a cave. I was left alone with my ragged breathing and the horrifying certainty that he could reappear at any moment. My first coherent thought was to reclaim my house, to banish whatever presence he represented. I stumbled around, grabbing a flashlight from a drawer, ignoring the surge of fear that each step in the dark brought. The corridor felt even colder now, an icy draft creeping under the bedroom doors. By the time I reached the end of the hall, the storm outside had begun to subside, but the hush that replaced it was somehow worse. Every nerve in my body braced for that figure to leap out from the shadows. I returned to the living room, sweeping the flashlight beam over furniture and walls. My reflection glimmered in the window glass, pale and damp with perspiration. Eyes wide with dread, I realized with mounting anxiety that the mirror was nowhere to be found. The cloth he used to wrap it, the tarnished silver handle, everything was just gone. The only trace he left behind was the envelope on my desk. Its seal had been broken, the letter inside half pulled out. When I mustered the courage to look at it, I found nothing overtly significant, just an old family letter. Yet seeing it disturbed felt like an invasion far more personal than if he'd just stolen my television or rummaged through my belongings. It was a confirmation of his ability to reach into the most private corners of my life, rearranging them to suit a purpose I didn't understand. Unable to endure the suffocating tension any longer, I stepped outside onto the front porch, letting the rain-scented air fill my lungs. My skin was prickled with goosebumps, and my heart refused to settle into a normal rhythm. The streetlights glowed dimly, blurred by drizzle. I checked the windows from the outside, half expecting to glimpse that silhouette lurking within, waiting for me to return. All I saw was my own solitary reflection, a tired man with fear etched into every line of his face. I never did recover that strange mirror, nor did I see the intruder again, at least not in any concrete sense. For days I slept poorly, always, glancing at corners, flinching at the slightest creak. Occasionally I swear I heard soft footsteps in the hallway at odd hours of the night, but whenever I investigated I found nothing. The sense of being watched, however, has never entirely left me. Each time the power flickers or the house settles with a groan, I feel a spike of panic in my chest. I listen, waiting for that hush to intensify that subtle shift in the atmosphere that signals the presence of something not quite human. Sometimes late in the evening, I catch myself checking the reflection of the living room in any reflective surface, the blank TV screen, the darkened window, even the polished metal of my coffee pot, half expecting to see him there. A part of me remains convinced that I will look into a mirror one day and see that future scene again, an empty room, a flickering light, and a blurred form rummaging through my drawers. The memory of that reflection and its eventual real-life unfolding refuses to fade. It clings to my thoughts, reminding me of a reality in which time can twist in on itself without explanation, bridging past, present, and future into one horrifying distortion. And maybe I'm not just imagining things when I sense a faint static in the air, or a dim corner of the house that grows darker than it should. There are nights I jolt awake convinced I saw a flash of tarnished silver near the doorframe, or a partial silhouette sliding from view. The moment my eyes adjust to the dark, I can't prove any of it, but I know what happened was real, at least as real as the sweat that slid down my back, the hammering of my heart, and the dryness of my throat as I face that impossible vision. I've considered leaving this house, but the thought brings little comfort. I have the unsettling suspicion that distance won't help me escape. The mirror was just an instrument, a glimpse of a deeper, inexplicable force that found its way into my life. Whether I stay or go, I feel marked by it. The intangible presence that once visited my home could reemerge anywhere, producing that relic mirror once again to show me another slice of a future I'd rather not see. In the end, I remain living with the open question of whether my reality is as linear as I once believed. And each time I pass by the desk, that envelope catches my eye, a small, unassuming reminder of how fragile the boundary is between what we know and what lurks beyond our understanding. Despite the oppressive sense of uncertainty, I go on with my daily routine. I make coffee in the morning. I lock my doors at night. Yet beneath it all, I can't help feeling that my caution is wasted. Locks and walls do little to keep out the things that slip in through the cracks of logic and reason. I still dream about that swirling reflection in the mirror. I see the dark figure rummaging through my belongings, seeking answers to questions I can't comprehend. Sometimes I'm the one behind the mirror watching myself from the other side. Each morning I wake up shaken, but also strangely relieved to find myself alone, at least for the moment. And that perhaps is the cruelest legacy of that night. The knowledge that I can't fully trust what I see, what I hear, or even what I remember. I live with a constant low-level dread that I might turn a corner or glance into a reflective surface and find him again, tarnished mirror in hand, offering me yet another prophecy of what's to come. And the worst part is knowing I wouldn't be able to stop it from unfolding, no matter how fast my heart beats or how many locks I secure. In this house, and perhaps in my mind, time itself seems eager to splinter, opening a door for whatever presence still lurks in the shadows, waiting to step back into my reality. Story 11, I could feel it the moment I set foot in that abandoned corridor. An unwelcome chill that seemed to seep through the walls. The air felt dense, as though weighed down by unseen eyes, and every breath tasted stale. My heart thudded against my ribcage, instinct warning me to turn around and leave. Yet I found myself stepping further in, drawn by an inexplicable need to understand what lingered in that silent, looming darkness. The floor creaked under my weight, with every step an erratic metronome echoing in this unnatural hush. That alone might have unsettled me under ordinary circumstances. But there was something else in the air, a faint whisper or perhaps a shiver of movement, just beyond the feeble light cast by the flickering overhead bulb. It felt as if the corridor itself was breathing with me, waiting for me to take the next step deeper into its secrets. I should explain how I ended up there, though I can't say I fully grasp it myself. Late that evening, I received a phone call from a contact who told me someone wanted to discuss matters of grave importance. The voice on the other end said it would be best to meet at an old industrial complex on the outskirts of town. I recall the tone was calm but urgent. Part of me hesitated, but I was compelled by curiosity. I had heard rumors about that complex, mostly talk of illegal gatherings or bizarre happenings after dark. I told myself I would go for no more than a few minutes just to see what was so pressing. When I arrived, the entire place loomed like a forgotten giant. Towering warehouses coated in rust-broken windows that resembled jagged teeth and rotted wooden pallets strewn around as if something had torn through them. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, producing a hollow moaning sound that sent a jolt of apprehension through my gut. The corridor I entered was part of the main warehouse lined with overhead lights, half of which were burned out. The ones that still worked flickered like dying candles, casting more shadow than illumination. At first I thought I was alone. My footsteps echoed in the corridor, each step forging a lonely rhythm. A moment later I noticed two men standing at the far end. Silhouettes in that uneven glow, I felt my heart pound as I approached. My palms were damp and my throat constricted. They weren't moving. Their stillness reminded me of statues or mannequins. Their heads seemed slightly bowed as though they were in deep contemplation, or possibly listening to something I couldn't hear. The first disturbing thing I noticed was their shadows. They stretched out on the wall behind them, but they didn't align naturally with the trembling fluorescent light above. Instead, these shadows seemed to pulse and flicker independently, as if they possessed a life of their own. My breath caught in my throat. I recalled blinking, trying to clear my vision. But no matter how hard I tried, the distorted shapes continued dancing across the wall like dark flames. I greeted the men by asking who had called me there. I remember their answer coming in hushed, monotone voices. They stated they were there to share information that could change my future. In my mind, I was screaming, "Get out now, walk away." But I was paralyzed by a fascination mixed with a rising dread. They stepped closer, and I felt trapped by my own body's refusal to move. Up close, the men looked ordinary enough, or so I thought at first glance. One wore a tattered jacket and a pair of heavy boots scuffed at the toes. The other had a cleaner appearance, possibly wearing some kind of formal shirt, though it was wrinkled and looked several sizes too large for his frame, but their faces had a pallor as though the blood didn't quite reach their cheeks. Their eyes appeared hollow, as if something behind them had receded into darkness. I felt as though I was looking at actors in a dreadful play or at cadavers who had been dressed up for a grim exhibit. As they spoke softly, I heard the faint sound of shifting behind them. My eyes darted to the wall, and I noticed their shadows swinging gently side to side, mouths parting in silent mimicry. It was as though the shadows themselves were holding a separate conversation, one that didn't require the men to move at all. The men's bodies remained almost entirely still, their voices low and deliberate, but their shadows twisted with silent animation. Every time they paused, the shadows' mouths kept opening and shutting as if they were devouring invisible words. A creeping terror snaked up my spine and my hands trembled. My heart thrashed in my chest and cold sweat dampened the nape of my neck. I struggled to keep my voice steady, asking them what they wanted from me. They answered that I was chosen to partake in something beyond my current comprehension. Their monotone approach frightened me more than if they had been openly menacing. There was no threat in their tone, just certainty and inevitability. I could hear a faint hum or a buzz within the corridor's walls. It reminded me of old fluorescent lights about to burn out, or giant insects trapped within the wiring. It was maddening to concentrate on their words while that noise droned in my ears. I felt a sudden urge to run, but before I knew it, They gestured for me to follow them into an adjoining room. My instinct screamed not to comply, but fear played a twisted game with my logic. I reasoned that if I stayed in the corridor, I'd be isolated with no clear path out. Perhaps in the room there might be a window or another exit. So I followed them, noticing with each step how their shadows elongated, creeping along the walls like living tendrils searching for prey. When we entered the room, I saw it was lit by a single bulb hanging from a frayed cord in the center. The floor was littered with broken glass and scraps of metal, making every step precarious. The men stood on either side of me, glancing at each other as if confirming something unspoken. Then they turned their gazes directly on me. The hum in my ears grew louder, almost drowning out my own thoughts. I focused on the pounding of my heart, the dryness in my mouth, the clammy sweat forming on my forehead. They told me through that flat, emotionless speech that I needed to stand by a particular marking on the floor, a circular stain that looked suspiciously like old grease, or maybe something more disturbing. I refused stepping back, only to feel something behind me brush against my ankles. Startled, I whipped around to find only a corner of the room, yet I could have sworn I felt a hand or a claw gripping me. My mind reeled. My vision blurred momentarily. It was then that I saw the men's shadows more clearly than ever. Each shadow stood against the wall, arms extended, fingers outstretched, swaying in a manner disconnected from the men's actual bodies. The men themselves remained almost perfectly still, just slight movements to shift weight from one foot to another, but their shadows writhed as though in silent frenzy. My stomach lurched with nausea. The flickering bulb overhead made the shadows jerk spastically, creating the illusion that they were creeping along the wall in increments. Unable to suppress the terror any longer, I demanded to know what was happening. One of the men's voices droned that I was on the cusp of a grand revelation. He mentioned that once I understood the truth, there would be no going back. The other man said something to him in a hushed tone, an odd expression briefly passing across his face. I was too disoriented to decipher the full meaning of their words, but something about the finality of it all filled me with dread. They moved toward me. My fight or flight instinct erupted, but I discovered my legs rooted in place. Their hands gripped me under the arms as if preparing to lift me, and I froze in absolute panic. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I found myself gasping for air as though an invisible weight pressed on my chest. Despite the crippling fear, my immediate response was to struggle, yet my limbs felt heavy, drained of strength. I recall the feeling of numbness spreading through my extremities, making each movement stilted and feeble. As they lifted me, I caught sight of the shadows on the wall again. This time, those silhouettes stretched downward, the elongated limbs flailing with desperate intent. I felt a cold shiver run down my legs as the shadow's arms seemed to reach out, fingers playing in my direction. Horrified, I watched the silhouettes as they clawed at the wall in an attempt to grip my ankles. Their outstretched forms lengthened far beyond what should have been possible under that single bulb. The effect was as if the shadows had become living creatures with their own malevolent desires. My breathing turned ragged and tears stung my eyes as I realized I was suspended in the air, the men holding me up with unnatural ease. The floor lurched beneath me in my dizziness, and I couldn't tell if I was imagining the corridor spinning or if the men were twisting me around. My mind raced with questions. Was I dreaming, hallucinating? My heart threatened to burst, pounding so violently it felt like a drumbeat in my skull. In that moment, the shadows on the wall, my captor's shadows, stretched so far they practically reached the center of the room as if trying to snare my feet. I kicked at them wildly, though my strikes met nothing but air. The men's actual bodies made no move to restrain my flailing legs, but their shadows seemed determined to make contact. I felt cold sweat trickle down my spine. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. The mechanical hum in my ears intensified, blending with the sound of my frantic heartbeat. I remember thinking that if the shadows succeeded in grabbing me, they might pull me into some unknown realm of darkness where I would be trapped. This dread sapped the last ounce of my composure. Suddenly, my left leg struck a broken metal pipe on the ground. The jolt of pain flashed through me like a lightning bolt, temporarily breaking whatever trance had kept me subdued. I let out a choked gasp, and with a final surge of adrenaline, I jerked free from the men's grip. I landed hard on the concrete pane shooting up my side. My vision blurred with tears and panic, but I forced myself upright. I staggered toward the doorway, ignoring the shards of glass biting into the soles of my shoes. In the confusion, I sensed the men following behind me. I refused to look back at their faces or at those writhing shadows. My only focus was the corridor and the faint promise of the exit beyond. The moment I spilled back into the corridor, I realized it too was steeped in darkness. The overhead lights had ceased their flicker and gone out entirely. The humming noise was replaced by a deafening silence. My breathing sounded monstrous in that stillness, amplified by my own fear. Behind me, I heard the scrape of footsteps. I pressed on, feeling along the wall with trembling hands. I was desperate for any indication of an exit. My mind spun in paranoid circles. I wondered if the men could see perfectly in the dark, if their shadows could form around me even in total blackness. Every brush of my clothing against the wall made me jolt. My chest felt tight and I could barely draw in air. Convinced that at any moment elongated fingers would wrap around my neck. Then, just as my last shred of hope was about to slip away, I spotted a pale beam of moonlight cutting through a crack in the metal door at the end of the corridor. Without hesitation, I barreled toward it, ignoring the stings of debris and the relentless throbbing in my side. My breath came in shallow bursts and a metallic taste filled my mouth. As I reached the door, I fumbled with the rusted handle, my sweaty palms making it almost impossible to turn. With a final desperate wrench, the latch gave way and I stumbled outside into the night air. The contrast was jarring. The moon hung overhead, pale and silent, casting faint light across the deserted lot. I collapsed against the side of the building, sucking in lungfuls of cold air. I felt my heartbeat gradually slow to a rapid throb instead of a full-on hammering. For a moment, I was convinced the men would emerge behind me, shadows twisting around my own, ready to pull me back into that labyrinth of horror. But the door remained shut. No one followed. I stood there under the moon's glare, my clothes ragged and my body shaking with aftershocks of adrenaline. My mind reeled with the possible explanations. Trickery, a shared delusion, something that might have been drug-induced. Yet none of those possibilities soothed me. My memory of those writhing shadows and their frantic attempts to grab my feet remained too vivid. I felt a creeping sensation at the edges of my consciousness, as though the darkness behind my own eyelids was trying to form shapes of its own. Eventually, I found the strength to walk, forcing myself away from that warehouse. My footsteps echoed in the empty lot, each step a reminder that I was still alive, still real. But with every passing moment, I couldn't shake the sensation that some part of that place had come with me, lurking in the corners of my vision. Even when I was sure I was alone, I felt observed. The clammy dread in my chest refused to dissipate, a cold heaviness that clung to me like an unwanted second skin. That night's sleep remained impossible. Every time I drifted, I jolted awake, convinced I saw silhouettes shifting in the darkness of my bedroom. My shadow on the wall, cast by a small nightlight, seemed to quiver in the corner of my eye. I felt my sanity teeter on the edge. I had to reassure myself aloud in a trembling voice that what I witnessed might have been a trick of the failing fluorescent lights or an illusion fed by exhaustion and anxiety. Yet deep down there was a gnawing certainty that those shadows were more than illusions. The memory of them twisting and reaching out was too sharp, too real. Even now, recalling that moment sends tremors through my body. Sometimes I think I hear whispering in dark corridors, or see faint stirring when no one else is around. I catch myself jumping at the sight of my own reflection, half expecting it to move out of sync. I don't know exactly what those two men were. I don't know if they were part of something far bigger, something ancient, or something newly born from the recesses of our world. I do know that in their presence, reality itself felt different, stretched thin, allowing things that should not be possible to manifest. It's a truth I can't unlearn. I left that warehouse behind, but I sense it hasn't let me go. The dread lingers coiling in my mind, reminding me that I touched something beyond ordinary comprehension. When I walk alone at night, I sometimes glimpse figures just at the edge of the streetlights. Their bodies remain still, but their shadows sway and shift in uncanny ways. In those moments, my throat goes dry and my pulse thunders. I pick up my pace, refusing to look back, unable to forget how those shadows once tried to pull me under. I've told myself I survived the encounter. But the question remains, did I truly escape, or was I marked by those living shadows for something that hasn't yet come to pass? I live each day waiting for the next sign, the next flicker of unnatural movement in the corner of my eye. And the most unsettling realization is that I'm no longer entirely sure if my own shadow is still mine. Sometimes I see it out of the corner of my vision, swaying just a fraction of a second slower or faster than my body, as if it's listening for some silent call, waiting for its moment to move on. Its own story 12. I remember the exact moment it all began, a low hum in my ears that pulsed in rhythm with the overhead lights in my studio. My skin felt clammy and a tingling pressure at the back of my skull refused to go away. Each time I took a breath, the air itself felt stale, like it had been trapped behind a locked door for too long, waiting for someone to release it. That was when I realized something was deeply, profoundly wrong. There was nothing outwardly amiss. The curtains were drawn, the digital screens glowed steadily, and my camera sat on the desk as always. But beneath that ordinary surface, a crawling sensation told me that something invisible was watching, hiding just outside my field of vision. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling grew, sinking its claws into my gut and rooting itself there. I'm a professional photographer, and I've spent countless late nights hunched over my editing desk, enhancing images for clients. I used to love the process, meticulously adjusting exposure, color balance, and contrast until each photo matched my memory of the moment I'd captured. It was therapeutic in a way, transforming fleeting snapshots into polished pieces of art. When I accepted a recent assignment to photograph a small wedding, I expected a familiar routine. Hours in front of my computer, a faint glow illuminating the space, and the subtle hum of hardware as it processed memories captured on my memory cards. But the wedding I shot a few days ago was unlike any I'd ever experienced. I was hired by a couple who wanted a simple ceremony. It took place on a sun-drenched afternoon at a rustic venue dotted with tall trees. There were no major complications that day, no sign of rain, no disorganized schedule. The newlyweds stood arm in arm, radiating joy, while I snapped away with my camera, capturing them at every angle. By the end of the night, I congratulated them, packed my gear, and drove home without any suspicion that my life would soon unravel. Back at my studio, I started the usual post-production process, uploading the files, creating backup folders, scanning the images for any that needed immediate retouching. Initially, everything seemed fine. The first 24 photos were normal. The bride smiling in the morning light, the groom adjusting his tie, the couple laughing in front of the wedding arch. But then, halfway through the album, I came upon a shot that made my heart hammer against my ribs. The photo showed an angle of the reception hall I did not remember taking. It was nighttime in this image, the only light coming from strings of flickering bulbs suspended above the dance floor. The crowd was frozen in mid-celebration, but they weren't celebrating anything I recognized. In fact, their expressions looked twisted, almost pained, and in the corner just beyond the reach of the overhead lights stood a figure I swore looked exactly like me. The more I zoomed in, the clearer it became. The face, the stance, the slight tilt of the head. It was a perfect reflection of my own posture. My mind reeled and a dense wave of nausea rose in my throat. I tried to reassure myself that it was just a trick of the light or a case of mistaken identity. Perhaps one of the guests shared my build or wore similar clothes, but that excuse crumbled the second I checked the metadata. The timestamp indicated the photo was taken hours after I had already left the venue. Somehow the file existed in my folder stamped with my camera model and lens, and yet it depicted a scene that never took place while I was physically there. My neck hair bristled and I could feel cool sweat forming at my temples. I blinked, dryness in my mouth intensifying, and stared again, convinced I must be misunderstanding something. Scrolling forward, I found more anomalies, images of the same space but changed. In these photos, the decor was rearranged. The guests wore different clothing, and the same version of me appeared in each shot. Standing closer and closer to the camera, my heart thudded so loudly that it felt like a drum resonating inside my chest. When I attempted to print one of these strange images, hoping to see if the physical copy revealed the same perplexing details, the printer jammed. The paper spat out halfway, and the image displayed wild distortions as though an unseen hand had smeared the ink from within. The nearly printed photo showed me standing in the background, arms by my sides, face turned toward the lens, eyes locked on the viewer. Every nerve in my body felt electrified as I stared at that half-printed face. It was definitely me, but older lines etched around the eyes, the expression haunted by something I couldn't pinpoint, and somehow I got the overwhelming sensation that this future me, was staring right back. My hand shook so much that the paper slipped from my grip and fluttered to the floor. When I picked it up and looked again, fresh ink was still dripping, staining my fingertips. In those glistening spots, the figure's eyes seemed to shift slightly, tracking my movements. I felt a surge of panic. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back until my leg bumped against a chair. The noise startled me. In the suffocating silence of the studio, I told myself to take a break, to step outside for a moment of fresh air. But as I started to stand, I caught a glimpse of movement on my computer screen. The photo I'd been editing had changed while I wasn't looking. The background lights were dimmer, the atmosphere gluier. A single balloon, previously white, now appeared in a bold crimson color, drifting near the top edge of the frame. I remembered no balloons of that color at the actual event. A chill wound its way up my spine, and I had to swallow hard to keep my composure. A voice inside my head insisted that I must be imagining things, perhaps induced by exhaustion. I flicked through more images in hopes of finding normalcy, but each new shot defied reality. Some showed the wedding hall in partial disarray, tables, overturned decorations scattered as if an intense wind had swept through. Others displayed glimpses of me at the editing desk itself, looking frantic and disheveled, as though someone had snapped candid shots of me from behind while I worked. I jerked my head around, scanning my studio to confirm I was alone. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, sending a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. In that brief moment of darkness, I sensed a presence behind me, almost as though someone were leaning over my shoulder. I whipped around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. My breathing was ragged and cold. Droplets of sweat ran down the sides of my face. The hum in my ears intensified, merging with the unsteady flicker of electricity, creating a distorted sense of reality. Determined to ground myself, I reached for the wedding's original memory card. If these bizarre images existed, they had to be on the raw files. Yet as I opened the card on my computer, I realized that the folder structure had changed. Some files were missing, replaced by folders with cryptic names. I didn't recognize strange sets of numbers and letters that followed no logical pattern. When I clicked on one, it contained images of objects I had never photographed. A wilted bouquet, a shattered mirror, and most troublingly, my own camera lying on a table covered in unidentifiable stains. I felt a wave of revulsion so strong that my stomach cramped. It took every ounce of willpower to keep from slamming the laptop shut and running. I started to wonder if maybe I was experiencing some form of dissociation or stress-induced hallucination. The more I considered it, though, the more I realized that every sense felt painfully acute. The squeak of my chair, the beep of the computer tower, the subtle scent of developer fluid from my old dark room supplies. They all rang out with perfect clarity. If this was a hallucination, it was more vivid than anything I'd ever heard of. Resolute in my need for answers, I performed a system restore, hoping to revert the files to a previous state. The progress bar inched forward, and I stared at the blinking cursor, a knot tightening in my stomach. As soon as the restore completed, I reopened the folder. The images had changed again. This time, the so-called future me appeared closer to the foreground in every shot. He was no longer relegated to the corners or the background. He stood near the center of the frame, his gaze fixated on the camera. In some photos, he even wore the same clothes I had on in that moment. My worn sweatshirt with a coffee stain on the sleeve. My palms were slick with sweat and my throat felt parched. Every breath I took felt like a rasping drag through thickening air. The studio lights seemed to dim on their own, casting elongated shadows that made the corners of the room look cavernous. I shivered even though the temperature on the thermostat hadn't changed. At one point I thought I heard a faint rustle in the corner behind the cabinets. I turned the volume down on the computer and strained to listen. It sounded like something was sliding across the floor. A soft scrape followed by silence. My lungs seized up, refusing to expand, and a cool sweat broke out along my spine. Step by step, I edged toward the source of the noise, bracing myself for whatever I might find. But behind the cabinet, there was nothing unusual, just a tangle of cords and cables. Yet when I spun back around, an object lay on my editing desk that definitely hadn't been there before. A small decorative figurine of a wedding cake topper. The bride and groom's faces blurred beyond recognition. I recognized it from one of the bizarre photos that had appeared in the corrupted folders. The shock nearly made me drop to my knees. My mind raced, calculating the impossible nature of this. An object from a photograph. A photograph I never remembered taking had manifested in my studio as though crossing over from another dimension. My throat felt so dry that I swallowed painfully and my heart pounded an irregular rhythm against my ribs. I gingerly picked up the figurine, noticing how cold and rough it felt. A chilling thought lodged itself in my brain. Every change in the photos was beginning to bleed into my actual surroundings. I lost track of time. My eyes stung from staring at the screen and my body felt drained of energy. Yet my mind buzzed with restless tension. I alternated between searching for logical explanations. Maybe I was hacking my own system by accident. Or maybe a virus had infected my software and sinking into a paralyzing dread that defied rational thought. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to rest my forehead on the desk, but when I closed my eyes, the images came unbidden. Future versions of me, places I had never been, objects I had never owned, all swirling in a disorienting kaleidoscope. At some point, I decided to try printing the entire set of strange images, foolishly hoping that a physical copy might help me make sense of the situation. One by one, I sent them to the printer. The pages slid out, each depicting more warped scenes. Shadows elongated behind me and the pictures forming shapes that resembled reaching hands. Some prints showed me from behind editing photos in the dead of night while a figure loomed in the corner. My chest felt so tight that each breath was a battle. I kept a trembling hand hovering near the power switch, ready to shut everything down if the terror became too much. Partway through the printing, a sudden glint of motion on one of the papers caught my eye. It was a slow shift, like the changing frames of an animation. The figure, my future self, turned its head by a fraction of an inch. The movement was faint but unmistakable. I gasped, heart pounding like a jackhammer in my chest. The corners of the photograph curled upward as though heated from behind. Then the rest of the stack began to shift. The images seeming to blend with one another, corners overlapping in a chaotic swirl. Clenching my teeth, I tore the prints apart from one another, ink smeared across my hands and wrists, the smell of chemicals burning in my nostrils. Every nerve in me screamed that I should stop, that each manipulation of these images was altering, not just the photographs, but the very fabric of my reality. Yet some morbid compulsion drove me to keep going. I had to confront whatever was trying to communicate with me through these pictures. In the final print that emerged, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a shot of the studio I was standing in at that very moment, down to the detail of an empty coffee mug on the desk. But in the photograph, the lights were off and the entire room was illuminated by the screen's glow alone. The future version of me stood behind my chair, looking directly into the camera lens, his eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling intensity. In his left hand, he clutched a single piece of torn photograph. Without thinking, I spun around. There was no one there. A wave of dizziness washed over me, forcing me to grip the table for support. My heart beat so violently that I worried it would burst. A cold sweat coated my forehead and made my shirt cling to my back. The edges of my vision blurred, and for a split second I heard that low hum again, the same one that had been droning earlier. Though shaking, I forced myself to gather the prints, tuck them into a folder, and exit my studio. Outside, the cool night air assaulted my lungs, and I staggered forward until I felt the rough bark of a tree under my palm. I leaned against it, trying to slow my breathing. For a few minutes, I stood there listening to the faint sound of passing cars and the rustle of leaves. The normal world still existed somewhere beyond the madness unfolding in my studio. I had a choice to walk away and never look back, or to return and find a final answer. Every bone in my body trembled at the thought of stepping foot inside that building again. Yet the idea of letting these nightmarish visions control my life felt unbearable, summoning the last reserves of my courage. I wiped the sweat from my brow and re-entered the studio. Inside, everything was still. The monitors had gone to sleep, their black screens reflecting the faint overhead glow. The prints lay in a disheveled pile on the desk I could hear, my own breathing echo against the walls. With shaky fingers, I turned on the main light. It flickered once, then stabilized. I looked around for new manifestations, any more objects that might have crawled out of the photos and into my reality. The wedding cake figurine was still there exactly where I had left it. Determined to end this nightmare, I deleted the corrupted files, every last one of them, and then reformatted the memory card. My hands quivered the entire time, but I managed to complete the steps without allowing my panic to derail me. When the final purge was done, I stared at the empty directory, a hollowness welling up inside me. I half expected the files to reappear immediately, mocking my attempts at control, but they didn't. I picked up the folder of printed images, carried it outside to a nearby metal drum, and set it on fire using a lighter fluid I keep for emergencies. My throat tightened as I watched the edges of the paper curl and blacken, the images warping and melting into unrecognizable ash. The stench of burning ink stung my nostrils. A swirl of smoke rose into the sky, carrying the remnants of that impossible future with it. As the flames died down, I felt my heart gradually return to a steadier rhythm. In the days that followed, I half expected reality to collapse around me, or for more objects from those eerie photographs to materialize in my home. But nothing happened. My studio returned to its mundane state. The hum and flicker of the light subsided, and the normal routine of professional photography resumed. The wedding clients contacted me to ask when they might receive their photos, so I edited the legitimate ones and sent them off carefully, omitting any mention of the impossible images I had encountered. They thanked me politely, never indicating anything strange had happened at their reception. Even so, a lingering sense of dread remains. At night, I sometimes catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, a trick of the light. Perhaps I see an older version of myself staring back, an expression of unspoken warning etched into my features, and in those moments my heart quickens. Sweat beads on my temples and an icy dread settles in my stomach. I remind myself it's all in my head, that I destroyed every trace of whatever that was. But the memory lingers like an old scar. Sometimes I wake up convinced I hear the faint hiss of static or the soft click of a camera shutter coming from my studio. I tell myself it's only my imagination. Yet the knowledge that those impossible photos once existed weighs heavily on me. A creeping paranoia gnaws at the edges of my mind, whispering that maybe reality is not as solid as I once believed. And though I burn the prints, I can never be entirely sure I've severed the connection between my present and that haunting future. I have no proof that any of this ever happened. No images, no files, no diaries. The only evidence is the dull ache in my chest that flares up whenever I think about that future version of me lurking at the periphery of each shot, edging closer frame by frame. There are nights when sleep eludes me and I can feel my heart thudding dully under the weight of my own lingering terror. I've considered leaving photography altogether, but something compels me to keep going. Perhaps it's a need to prove to myself that I'm not afraid, or maybe it's the faint hope that someday I'll uncover a logical explanation. Yet, in the deepest part of my mind, I know that logic won't save me from the impossible. There is a fracture in the world that I once took for granted, and no amount of rationalizing can seal it shut again. Even now, as I sit here typing these words, my fingertips feel numb and I glance over at the corner of my desk. The wedding cake topper remains slightly chipped from when I first found it. I can't bring myself to throw it out as if discarding it might awaken something far worse. It's my only souvenir of that harrowing night, a reminder that reality can twist in ways we can't begin to fathom. And so I remain here haunted by photographs I'll never see again, bound by the knowledge that somewhere in some unreachable future, another version of me might still be standing in a darkened reception hall, camera in hand, gazing through the lens with eyes that have witnessed far too much. All I can do is wait, heart pounding, breath ragged, and hope that whatever force connected our timelines will stay silent. But in the quiet moments when the hum in my ears grows louder, I still feel it watching, and I know our story is far from over. Story 13, I remember the way the mist seemed to cling to my skin as soon as I set foot on the rotting pier that morning. An unshakable feeling of unease winding its way around my chest like a tightening rope. The lake stretched out in front of me, an expanse of grayish water and low-hanging fog that distorted the horizon. Some whispered rumor in the back of my mind insisted that on certain days this body of water revealed hidden dangers, though I had shrugged off such cautionary tales more times than I could count. After all, I was just a captain offering sightseeing tours on a remote lake tucked away from the usual tourist traps. Yet something about that day, maybe the oppressive humidity or the way the sky swallowed all warmth, put me on edge before I ever started the engine. I climbed aboard my modest vessel and did a quick check of the throttle life vests in the small cabin. My breath came out in short bursts and my skin felt clammy in the chill. The boat groaned under my footsteps as though dreading the trip ahead. Even my reflection in the water for a split second appeared warped and strangely distant, as if it were someone else staring back. I tried to shake off the sense of foreboding by focusing on routine tasks. Adjusting the ropes and scanning for any mechanical issues sometimes helped calm my nerves. That morning, though every little click or rustle made me jerk my head around, I even caught myself peering toward the treine, half expecting to see shapes lurking there. Nothing but silent pines and a heavy dampness that made the air taste metallic. When I heard footsteps approaching from the far end of the pier, it almost felt like a relief. Some company to chase away that unsettling quiet. 5 tourists appeared through the haze. I'd been contacted by a booking service the previous evening, told that a group wanted an early tour. They hadn't provided much information aside from a time and a request for a route that skimmed the far shore. When the tourists boarded, they moved without much chatter. They barely looked me in the eye. Their steps were synchronized and each wore a faint, vacant smile. One of them murmured a greeting, though I found it hard to decipher the words because they spoke almost in a whisper. I chalked it up to the thick fog distorting sounds as it often did. My stomach nodded. Still, it was my job to show them around, so I forced a polite nod and directed them to seats around the boat. The engine chugged to life. The boat swayed as I eased away from the dock, watching the reflection of pine trees glide across the lake surface. The fog seemed even denser out in open water. It swallowed the boat as though it had a mind of its own. Beads of sweat formed at my temples despite the cool air. The tourist remained quiet, which was unusual. Most folks like to chatter or ask questions about the local legends. Here I sensed no curiosity from them, only a sort of focused silence. I tried to speak to one of them, describing how local fishermen believed the lake hid great depths where old vessels were rumored to have disappeared. I expected at least a nod of interest. Instead, I heard a low murmur pass among them as though they were sharing a secret. Their eyes grew distant, almost as if focusing on some point beyond the boat's horizon. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I tried to reassure myself that maybe they were just a reserved bunch, or that the early hour left them drowsy, but as the minutes crawled by, my hands started to tremble on the wheel. The boat's small radio crackled, spitting static. Usually I could pick up some weather updates, but it offered nothing decipherable that day. The air smelled stale, like wet stone and decaying leaves. My nerves tightened, and the sense of being observed noted at me. Every so often I glanced over my shoulder to find the tourists staring at me in unison, as though they had rehearsed the exact moment to turn their heads. I began to notice little changes in their appearance, subtle but enough to send my heart lurching. Their eyes lost their natural color, replaced by an inky black that glistened in the dim light. Their faces, previously showing mild curiosity or at least a polite semblance of calm, became eerily emotionless. Whenever I spoke, they would tilt their heads at the same angle as though trying to understand me in some detached, inhuman way. My throat felt parched, and I struggled to keep my voice steady. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled constantly. The boat rattled along, cutting through the water, but a sudden wave of nausea hit me. The lake, usually placid, took on a subtle current, as if shifting beneath my feet. I heard a faint sound, like soft chanting or maybe a muffled lullaby emanating from the passengers behind me. I tried to tell myself it was only the engine's hum. Soon, though, the chanting intensified, weaving under my skin until every muscle tensed. In an attempt to maintain control, I tried to check the compass. The needle swung erratically, refusing to settle. I tapped the glass, but the device seemed broken. A creeping chill enveloped me as I realized I couldn't rely on my usual navigation. I squinted through the haze, hoping to spot a familiar cluster of trees or a rock formation. Nothing looked right. It was as though the lake had transformed into an uncharted labyrinth of shifting fog and silent watchers. Suddenly I caught sight of something through the swirling mist, an outline of land where no island should exist. I'd navigated this lake dozens of times, but that dark silhouette was unfamiliar. My heartbeat thundered in my chest. The tourists behind me grew restless, their murmurs rising. They seemed drawn to that patch of land, pointing and leaning as if urging me to steer the boat in its direction. Their combined focus felt like a physical force pressing down on me. I recalled old stories about a mysterious island that appeared and disappeared under certain conditions. Locals insisted it was just a trick of the fog, but whispers claimed it only revealed itself once every 50 years, beckoning vessels toward it. My palms were clammy on the wheel. Trying to keep a firm grip, I attempted to turn away, but the engine spluttered, resisting my command. The chanting from behind me grew louder, and when I dared to glance at the passengers, I nearly lost my breath. They were looking straight at me, eyes black as ink, speaking in unison with voices that sounded drenched in an ancient accent I couldn't place. Though I didn't understand the words, their meaning felt darkly insistent, as though commanding me. My stomach churned with a wave of dread. I clenched the wheel, forced the throttle, and tried to change direction. The boat lurched but refused to veer off course. It was as if an invisible current pulled us toward that vanishing island. My mind raced. I'd heard rumors that the lake claimed vessels periodically every 50 years, to be precise. Right around this exact day, people vanished without explanation, only to have their boats discovered later empty and adrift. No one ever openly admitted what might have happened to those who went missing, but I'd always brushed off the gossip. Now I couldn't deny the parallels: the date, the strange behavior of my passengers, the appearance of this phantom island. My heart hammered so hard I tasted adrenaline at the back of my throat. Unable to turn the vessel, I dashed across the deck to check the engine, hoping to do anything to regain control. My breath came fast and sweat slicked my back. The chanting rose behind me, loud yet unnervingly in sync. When I reached the small maintenance hatch, I felt a presence looming over me. Slowly I twisted around. All 5 tourists stood unnaturally close, their mouths slightly open. They seemed to be repeating an otherworldly incantation, though the words came out garbled in my ears as if submerged underwater. One of them reached out of hand. I'll never forget the texture of their skin, damp, cold, almost rubbery. My pulse pounded. A vague memory of something I'd once read about ancient lake spirits and guardians slithered through my mind. I stumbled back, trying to keep distance while the group advanced. A crushing sensation of dread enveloped me like I was being forced into a role I never wanted to play. I managed to voice a protest, but they only responded by tilting their heads in eerie unison. My insides twisted, their lips parted, and that ancient tongue poured out of them loud and resonant. My vision blurred from the panic, and the entire boat seemed to tilt for a moment, as if the lake itself threatened to swallow us. I could barely breathe, let alone think of a logical plan to escape the island that was now looming larger through the fog. My eyes burned from the salt in the air and the sting of terror. I realized the tourists were not travelers at all. They were some manifestation spirits, perhaps, of others who had once vanished in these waters. The revelation made my hands shake uncontrollably. It was as if they had come back possessed by an aquatic entity that needed a new caretaker, someone to remain behind so the cycle could continue. My heart slammed against my ribs and my eyes stung with sweat. In that moment, I truly questioned my sanity. Could I be delirious, hallucinating from some toxin in the water? Every rational explanation slipped away when I felt a collective push guiding me toward the edge of the boat. I fought to stay upright, latching onto a metal railing. My muscles quivered with exertion. I remembered a phrase an old man once muttered to me about this lake having a will of its own. He claimed that it always had a guardian, some figure bound to it in an endless cycle. I never gave it more than a passing thought until that instant confronted by the black-eyed group who seemed intent on forcing me to take up that role. For a moment I tried to scream for help, but all I heard was my own shaky exhale and the continued chorus of voices that seemed to penetrate my skull. The boat's hull bumped against something solid. We had reached the perimeter of the island, though calling it an island felt wrong. It was more a knot of twisted roots and slick black rocks. I tried to look away, but my gaze was caught by the writhing shapes along the shore. Were they branches, vines? They moved in a subtle dance as if welcoming the boat. My pulse raced and I could barely see straight through the haze of adrenaline. A stench rose from that landmass pungent with decay and brine. The tourist moved as one gesturing for me to step onto the rocks. My chest tightened with dread. Mouth so dry I could scarcely swallow. A part of me considered jumping overboard and swimming for the mainland. But the water's surface seemed to ripple with ominous shadows, and I had no clue where the shore might be in this twisting fog. Any direction could lead me further into disorientation. I gripped the boat's railing, torn between the horror of stepping onto that cursed ground and the paralyzing fear of sinking into the murky depths. They advanced again, chanting in that wet, echoing language, each syllable scraping at my nerves. My lungs felt compressed and my vision blurred from lack of oxygen. I forced my eyes shut and tried to reason. There had to be a way out. I had come out here as a captain just doing my job. I never asked for this. Yet the thought that perhaps it was destiny or a trap from the start made my stomach clench. The group pressed in their combined will, forcing my steps. The moment my foot landed on the slick rock of the island, a wave of nausea crashed over me. The chanting rose almost triumphant. I stumbled forward, hands scraping against a jagged surface. Warm blood trickled from my palm. A jolt of pain tore through me, but it at least cleared some of the fog in my mind. I saw an unearthly glow pulsing beneath the rocks as if the island itself had veins of phosphorescent energy. The chanting rippled and I heard the name of the lake repeated as though it were a living entity. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heart pound wildly. The tourists surrounded me, forming a half circle near the shore. Their unblinking black eyes created a solid wall of intense stares. My thoughts whirled. Searching for any piece of folklore that might save me, I remembered faint tales about someone confronting the lake spirit, refusing its demands. Perhaps that had ended in their disappearance, but I couldn't mention anything about that outcome. My mind blanked on details. Another wave of chanting assaulted my ears, and I sensed the presence in the water like a coiled serpent waiting to strike desperate. I backed away from the group, ignoring the stinging cut on my hand. Even as fear rat at my inside, some inner resolve flared. I wasn't ready to submit to the demands of an unseen force. I felt the boat's hull behind me still rocking at the water's edge. The group inched closer, arms raised, voices chanting. My skin crawled, an electric buzz of panic flooding my limbs. If I let them corner me on this island, I might never leave. And although the swirling mist and monstrous aura of the lake threatened to overwhelm me, I had to try and escape. I summoned every last shred of courage, pivoted on my heel, and launched myself back across the small gap between shore and boat. I stumbled hard as I landed, nearly pitching over the side, but managed to grab the railing. The chanting voices surged behind me. Without thinking, I scrambled to the cockpit, hands shaking so violently that I fumbled the ignition key. My heart hammered in my throat, breath ragged. The tourists? No. The spirits came to the very edge of the island, black eyes blazing with an intensity that threatened to swallow me. By some miracle, the engine sputtered to life. I felt the thrum under my feet, a thin ribbon of hope cutting through the dread. The boat struggled to move as though tangled in unseen weeds. I didn't let go of the throttle, muttering frantically under my breath. My entire body trembled, sweat pouring from my forehead. The chanting reached a crescendo, and I felt a force tugging at the boat, trying to drag it back toward that cursed island. I fought the wheel, forcing the craft to inch away. Time blurred. My lungs ached from quick, shallow breaths. Every second felt like an eternity as I urged the boat forward away from that dark patch of land. Little by little, I emerged from the swirling fog. I glanced over my shoulder just once to see the outline of those 5 figures receding into the gloom, still chanting in unison. The black water churned around them, and the island itself seemed to fade, swallowed by the haze until I wasn't sure if it had ever truly been there. My arms shook from clinging to the throttle, and my eyes burned with a mixture of relief and lingering horror. Somehow the lake spit me out near a familiar stretch of shoreline. I had no recollection of steering the boat there. My mind was in tatters, replaying the visions of black eyes, ancient syllables, and the glistening rocks beneath my feet. I cut the engine and drifted for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. My body was soaked in cold sweat, my heart still a thunderous drumbeat. The water here looked calm, almost welcoming, as if mocking the terror I had just escaped. When I finally reached the old pier, it was empty. The sky had taken on a lighter hue, as though dawn had finally wrestled free from the suffocating fog. I tied off the boat in silence. My legs were unsteady, and each step felt like I was walking on a tight rope. Climbing onto the pier, I looked back at my vessel, half expecting to see those 5 figures, waiting. But the deck was vacant. In the weeks since, I haven't been able to chase away the suspicion that something from that island attached itself to me. Sometimes in my dreams, I hear that chanting echo through endless corridors of mist. I jolt awake drenched in sweat, convinced I see shapes at the foot of my bed. My mirror occasionally plays tricks on me. I could swear my pupils dilate more than they should, as though some inky substance spreads across them. Then I blink, and it's gone. I tried to tell someone about the incident once, describing it vaguely to avoid sounding delirious. They just shrugged and joked that I'd had too much coffee before an early trip. But late at night, I recall the stories about the lake requiring a guardian. Every 50 years, I recall the unwavering stares of those 5 tourists and the dark compulsion that nearly trapped me on that island. If they were indeed the remnants of those who vanished decades ago, they remain bound to that haunting place, carrying out the lake's ancient will. I haven't returned to the deeper part of the lake since. Despite the fact that I'm still a captain by trade, I stick to the safer, shallower paths, far from the eerie, swirling fog. Yet I can't shake the sensation that I'm being watched. Even in calm waters, sometimes the reflection of my own eyes in the lake surface appears too dark. As though a fragment of that ancient entity took hold of me, I'm left with a choice that isn't really a choice. Continue my life as if nothing happened, or admit that something on that island demanded a new guardian. The watery hush that blankets the area after sundown reminds me that the cycle isn't broken. I escaped, at least for now, but the realization claws at my sanity. It's possible that one day I might hear that chanting again echoing across the water, summoning me back to a place that flickers into existence only when it's ready to claim someone. Every nerve in my body tenses at that thought. My hands tremble whenever I think about the island's twisted shapes and the way the fog parted just enough to reveal it. Sleep rarely brings rest anymore. A dull ache sits behind my eyes as though I'm constantly fighting off something that wants to seize control. If I ever relent even for a moment, I worry I might end up steering a new group across the lake, guiding them toward a phantom shore that appears and disappears at will. Also, a hidden force can continue its relentless search for another keeper. So here I stand, torn between fear and the quiet pull of something old and inescapable. I can't say with certainty what tomorrow holds. Only that this lake has demands that will be met whether by me or someone else I survive this round. But I'm not naive enough to believe the danger is past. The uneasy hush at dawn, the cold sweat that soaks my pillow, and the faint whiff of lake water in my dreams keep me tethered to that island's secret. And no matter how hard I try to ignore it, the day will come when the lake calls me again. When it does, I'll feel that ancient chant vibrating in my bones, urging me toward a place that shouldn't exist, and yet does. Hidden beneath layers of mist and malevolent silence,